Chapter 1. The Worst Birthday. Not for the first time, an argument had broken out over breakfast at number 4, Privet Drive. Mr. Vernon Dursley had been woken up in the early hours of the morning by a loud hooting noise from the room belonging to his niece Violet and nephew Harry. "Third time this week," he roared across the table. "If you can't control that owl, it'll have to go," Harry tried, yet again, to explain. "She's bored," he said. "She'd used to flying around outside." "If I could just let her out at night, do I look stupid?" snarled Uncle Vernon, a bit of fried egg dangling from his bushy mustache. "I know what'll happen if that owl's let out." He exchanged dark looks with his wife, Petunia. Harry tried to argue back, but his words were drowned by a long, loud belch from the Dursleys' son, Dudley. "I want more bacon." "There's more in the frying pan, sweetums," said Aunt Petunia, turning misty eyes on her massive son. "We must build you up while we've got the chance." "I don't like the sound of that school food." "Nonsense, Petunia. I never went hungry when he was at Smeltings," said Uncle Vernon heartily. "Dudley gets enough, don't you, son?" Dudley, who was so large his bottom drooped over either side of the kitchen chair, grinned and turned to Violet. "Pass the frying pan." "You've forgotten the magic word," said Violet irritably. The effect of this simple sentence on the rest of the family was incredible. Dudley gasped and fell off his chair with a crash that shook the whole kitchen. "Mrs. Dursley gave a small scream and clapped her hands to her mouth. Mr. Dursley jumped to his feet, veins throbbing in his temples. "I meant please," said Violet quickly. "I didn't mean, what have I told you?" thundered her uncle, spraying spit over the table, "about saying the muh word in my house." "But how dare you threaten Dudley?" roared Uncle Vernon, pounding the table with his fist. Harry tried to add voice to his sister's defense, but to no avail. I warned you. I will not tolerate mention of your abnormality under this roof." Violet stared from her purple-faced uncle to her pale aunt, who was trying to heave Dudley to his feet. "All right," said Violet. "All right." Uncle Vernon sat back down, breathing like a winded rhinoceros, and watching the twins closely out of the corners of his small, sharp eyes. Ever since Harry and Violet had come home for the summer holidays, Uncle Vernon had been treating them like a pair of bombs that might go off at any moment, because Harry and Violet Potter weren't normal children. As a matter of fact, they were as not normal as it was possible to be. Harry was a wizard, and Violet was a witch fresh from their first year at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. And if the Dursleys were unhappy to have them back for the holidays, it was nothing to how the twins themselves felt. They missed Hogwarts so much, it was like having a constant stomach ache. They missed the castle with its secret passages and ghosts, their classes, the mail arriving by owl, eating banquets in the great hall, sleeping in their four-poster beds in their separate dormitories, visiting the gamekeeper, Hagrid, in his cabin next to the forbidden forest in the grounds, and Harry especially missed Quidditch, the most popular sport in the wizarding world, played on broomsticks. What did the Dursleys care if Harry lost his place on the house Quidditch team because he hadn't practiced all summer? What was it to the Dursleys if Violet went back to school without any of her homework done? The Dursleys were what wizards called muggles, not a drop of magical blood in their veins. And as far as they were concerned, having a pair of wizards in the family was a matter of deepest shame. Uncle Vernon had even padlocked Harry's owl, Hedwig, inside her cage to stop carrying messages to anyone in the wizarding world. Crookshanks, Violet's enormous ginger cat, was lucky to avoid similar treatment. Not only was Uncle Vernon unable to get near him, but any time he stepped in the room, Crookshanks would begin emitting a loud, terrifying yowl. Violet and Harry looked nothing like the rest of the family. Uncle Vernon was large and necklace, with an enormous black mustache. Aunt Petunia was horse-faced and bony. Dudley was blonde, pink, and porky. The twins, on the other hand, were small and skinny, with brilliant green eyes and jet-black hair that was always untidy. Harry's liked to stick up at odd angles, while Violet's liked to wind itself into tangles and knots. The only other differences between them were Harry's glasses and the thin, lightning-shaped scar on his forehead. It was this scar that made Harry in particular so unusual, even for a wizard. This scar was the only hint of the twins' very mysterious past, of the reason they had been left on the Dursleys' doorstep 11 years before. At the age of 1 year old, Harry had somehow survived a curse from the greatest dark sorcerer of all time, Lord Voldemort, whose name most witches and wizards still feared to speak. His and Violet's parents had died in Voldemort's attack, but Violet had escaped unscathed, and Harry with only his lightning scar, and somehow nobody understood why Voldemort's powers had been destroyed the instant he failed to kill Harry. So the twins had been brought up by their dead mother's sister and her husband. They had spent 10 years with the Dursleys, never understanding why they kept making odd things happen without meaning no, believing the Dursleys' story that their parents had died in a car crash. And then, exactly a year ago, Hogwarts had written to Harry and Violet, and the whole story had come out. They had taken up their place at Wizard School, where the pair of them were famous. But now the school year was over, and they were back at the Dursleys for the summer, back to being treated like dogs. The Dursleys hadn't even remembered that today happened to be Violet and Harry's 12th birthday. Of course, their hopes hadn't been high. They'd never received a real present, let alone a cake, but for the Dursleys to ignore it completely. At that moment, Uncle Vernon cleared his throat important and said, "Now, as we all know, today is a very important day." The twins perked up and looked at each other, hardly daring to believe it. "This could we be the day I make the biggest deal of my career," said Uncle Vernon. They went back to their toast. Of course, Uncle Vernon was talking about the stupid dinner party. He'd been talking of nothing else for 2 weeks. Some rich builder and his wife were coming to dinner, and Uncle Vernon was hoping to get a huge order from him. Uncle Vernon's company made drills. "I think we should run through the schedule one more time," said Uncle Vernon. "We shall all be in position at 8 o'clock. Petunia, you will be in the lounge," said Aunt Petunia promptly, waiting to welcome them graciously to our home. "Good, good." "And Dudley, I'll be waiting to open the door." Dudley put on a foul, simpering smile. "May I take your coats, Mr. and Mrs. Mason?" "Thaver love him," cried Aunt Petunia rapturously. "Excellent, Dudley," said Uncle Vernon. Then he rounded on the twins. "We'll be in our bedroom, making no noise," said Violet. "And pretending we don't exist," added Harry, in the same toneless voice. "Exactly," said Uncle Vernon nastily. "I will lead them into the lounge, introduce you, Petunia, and pour them drinks." "At 8:15, I'll announce dinner," said Aunt Petunia. "And Dudley, you'll say, 'May I take you through to the dining room, Mrs. Mason?'" said Dudley, offering his fat arm to an invisible woman. "My perfect little gentleman," sniffed Aunt Petunia. "And you," said Uncle Vernon viciously to the twins. "We'll be in our room," Violet repeated, "making no noise and pretending we're not there." "Perfect. Dudley, how about we had to write an essay about our hero at school, Mr. Mason, and wrote about you?" This was too much for both Aunt Petunia and Harry. Aunt Petunia burst into tears and hugged her son, while Harry ducked under the table so they wouldn't see him laughing. "And you, boy," Harry struggled to keep his face straight as he emerged. "We'll be in our room," he said, at the exact same time as Violet, making no noise and pretending we aren't there. "Too right you will," said Uncle Vernon forcefully, though he looked perturbed. Uncle Vernon didn't like it when the twins spoke together, but then he didn't like anything else about them either. "The Masons don't know anything about you, and it's going to stay that way. When dinner's over, you take Mrs. Mason back to the lounge for coffee, Petunia, and I'll bring the subject around to drills. With any luck, I'll have the deal signed and sealed before the news at 10. We'll be shopping for a vacation home in Mallorca this time tomorrow." Harry and Violet couldn't feel too excited about this. They didn't think the Dursleys would care for them any better in Mallorca than they did on Privet Drive. "Right, I'm off to town to pick up the dinner jackets for Dudley and me. And you," he snarled at Violet. "You are to help your aunt with the cleaning." Harry shot Violet an apologetic look as he left through the back door. Violet followed her aunt dutifully into the kitchen, where she was set to scrubbing the stove and countertops until they shined. It was a rubbish birthday so far. No cards, no presents, and they would be spending the evening pretending not to exist. She scrubbed fiercely at the stovetop, trying to get up a bit of cooked-on egg. She had never felt so lonely. More than anything else at Hogwarts, Violet missed her best friends, Tracy Davis and Cassius Warrington. Neither of them had written to her all summer, even though Tracy had said she was going to ask Violet to come and stay. Harry hadn't received any mail from his friends, either. Countless times, the twins had been on the point of unlocking Hedwig's cage by magic and sending her off with letters, but it wasn't worth the risk. Underage, wizards weren't allowed to use magic outside of school. The twins hadn't told the Dursleys this. They knew it was only their terror that they might all be turned into dung beetles that stopped them from locking Harry and Violet in the cupboard under the stairs with their wands and other supplies. For the first couple of weeks back, they had enjoyed muttering nonsense words under their breath and watching Dudley tearing out of the room as fast as his fat legs would carry him. But the long silence from their friends made the twins feel so cut off from the magical world that even taunting Dudley had lost its appeal, and now everyone had forgotten their birthday. What wouldn't they give now for a message from Hogwarts, from any witch or wizard? They'd almost be glad for a sight of their self-declared archenemy, Draco Malfoy, just to be sure it hadn't all been a dream. Not that their whole year at Hogwarts had been fun. At the very end of last term, Harry had come face to face with none other than Lord Voldemort himself. Voldemort might be a ruin of his former self, but he was still terrifying, still cunning, still determined to regain power. Harry had slipped through Voldemort's clutches for a second time, but it had been a narrow escape, and even now, weeks later, Violet would be woken up by her brother's thrashing in his sleep. Drenched in cold sweat, muttering unintelligibly, Violet jumped at the sound of the screen door slamming shut. Dudley had gotten up from the breakfast table and waddled his way outside, likely to go and terrorize Harry. Fortunately, Harry was more than capable of terrorizing him back, and after a few short moments, Dudley was running screaming back into the house, howling that Harry had used you-know-what on him. Harry paid dearly for this moment of fun. As neither Dudley or anything in the backyard was hurt in any way, Aunt Petunia knew he hadn't really done magic, but she was still furious with him. She gave him extra work to do, with the promise he wouldn't eat again until he'd finished. While Dudley lolled around watching television and eating ice cream, the twins were busy cleaning the entire house. Inside and out, Violet was fortunately allowed to remain inside and out of the blistering sun, but Harry had no such luck. While he cleaned the windows, washed the car, mowed the lawn, and repainted the garden bench, Violet dusted every surface in the home, every knick-knack, polished every mirror and picture frame, vacuumed, swept, mopped, and waxed the floors. And when she was done with that, Aunt Petunia sent her outside as well to tend to the garden. Gardening was Violet's least favorite thing in the whole world. It was the one activity that Aunt Petunia seemed to enjoy, aside from spoiling her son, and she regularly roped Violet into joining her outside to trim the flower beds, prune and water the roses, and spread manure over it all so that everything grew back healthy and strong. Violet, who couldn't stand the feeling of dirt under her fingernails and was prone to overheating from the sun beating down on her back, took little enjoyment from these bonding sessions with her aunt. It was 7:30 in the evening when at last, exhausted, the twins heard Aunt Petunia calling them. "Get in here and walk on the newspaper." The two of them moved gladly into the shade of the gleaming kitchen. On top of the fridge stood tonight's pudding, a huge mound of whipped cream and sugared violets, the sight of which made Violet's mood sour even further, knowing she wouldn't be allowed to eat any of it. A loin of pork was sizzling in the oven. "Eat quickly." "The Masons will be here soon," snapped Aunt Petunia, pointing to two small plates containing slices of bread and lumps of cheese on the kitchen table. She was already wearing a salmon-pink cocktail dress. The twins washed their hands and bolted down their pitiful supper. The moment they had finished, Aunt Petunia whisked away their plates. "Upstairs, hurry!" As they passed the door to the living room, the twins caught a glimpse of Uncle Vernon and Dudley in bow ties and dinner jackets. They had only just reached the upstairs landing when the doorbell rang and Uncle Vernon's furious face appeared at the foot of the stairs. Remember, now one sound, Harry and Violet crossed to their bedroom on tiptoe, slipped inside, closed the door, and turned to collapse together onto their shared bed. The trouble was, there was already someone sitting on it. Chapter 2. Dobby's Warning. Violet clapped her hands over her mouth to stop from shouting, but it was a close thing. The little creature on the bed had large, bat-like ears and bulging green eyes the size of tennis balls. As they stared at each other, the twins heard Dudley's voice from the hall. "May I take your coats, mister?" And Mrs. Mason. The creature slipped off the bed and bowed so low that the end of its long, thin nose touched the carpet. Violet noticed that it was wearing what looked like an old pillowcase with rips for arm and leg holes. Hello," said Harry nervously. "Harry Potter, Violet Potter," said the creature in a high-pitched voice the twins were sure would carry down the stairs. "So long has Dobby wanted to meet you both. Such an honor it is." Thank you," said Violet, standing rooted to the spot as her brother edged along the wall and sunk into the desk chair next to Hedwig, who was asleep in her large cage. She wanted to ask, "What are you?" but thought it would sound too rude, so instead she said, "Who are you?" "Dobby, ma'am." "Just Dobby, Dobby the house elf," said the creature. "Oh, really?" said Harry. I don't want to be rude or anything, but this isn't a great time for us to have a house elf in our bedroom." Aunt Petunia's high, false laugh sounded from the living room. The elf hung his head. "Not that we aren't pleased to meet you," said Violet quickly, "but is there any particular reason you're here?" "Oh, yes, ma'am," said Dobby earnestly. "Dobby has come to tell you both. It is difficult, sir. Dobby wonders where to begin." "Sit down," said Harry politely, pointing to the bed. To their horror, the elf burst into tears, very noisy tears. Sit down," he wailed. "Never, never, ever." Violet thought she heard the voices downstairs falter. "Sorry," she whispered, shooting a desperate look at Harry. "He didn't mean to offend you or anything." "Offend Dobby," choked the elf. "Dobby has never been asked to sit down by a wizard like Inkwell." Violet, trying to say SHH, and look comforting at the same time, ushered Dobby back onto the bed where he sat hiccuping, looking like a large and very ugly doll. At last he managed to control himself and sat with his great eyes flitting between Harry and Violet in an expression of watery adoration. "You can't have met many decent wizards," said Harry, trying to cheer him up. Dobby shook his head. Then, without warning, he leapt up and started banging his head furiously on the window, shouting, "Badobby! Badobby, what are you doing?" Violet hissed, springing up and pulling Dobby back onto the bed. Hedwig had woken up with a particularly loud screech and was beating her wings wildly against the bars of her cage. "Harry, stop saying things to him. You're making it worse." "Dobby had to punish himself, ma'am," said the elf, who had gone slightly cross-eyed. "Dobby almost spoke ill of his family, ma'am." "Your family?" Harry asked, ignoring the venomous look Violet shot him. "The wizard family Dobby serves, sir. Dobby is a house elf bound to serve one house and one family forever." "Do they know you're here?" asked Violet gently. Dobby shuddered. "Oh, no, ma'am, no. Dobby will have to punish himself most grievously for coming to see you both. Dobby will have to shut his ears in the oven door for this. If they ever knew, ma'am, but won't they notice if you shut your ears in the oven door?" "Dobby doubts it, so Dobby is always having to punish himself for something, sir. They lets Dobby get on with it, sir. Sometimes they reminds me to do extra punishments." "But why don't you leave?" Violet asked, feeling slightly sick to hear of such horrible things. "Escape. A house elf must be set free, ma'am, and the family will never set Dobby free. Dobby will serve the family until he dies, ma'am." Violet stared. "And I thought it was bad staying here for another 4 weeks," Harry said. "This makes the Dursleys sound almost human. Can't anyone help you? Can't we?" Almost at once, Dobby dissolved again into wails of gratitude. "Please," Violet whispered frantically, "please be quiet." If the Dursleys hear anything, if they know you're here, Harry Potter asks if he can help Dobby. Dobby has heard of your greatness, sir, but of your goodness, Dobby never knew. Harry and Violet shared a look of incredulity between them. Whatever you've heard about my greatness, said Harry, looking very hot in the face, is a load of rubbish. I'm not even top of my year at Hogwarts. That's Violet. I'm not great either, said Violet quickly, shaking her head. I got high marks in a few classes, but that's all. Harry Potter is humble and modest, said Dobby reverently, his orb-like eyes aglow. Harry Potter speaks not of his triumph over he who must not be named, Voldemort, said the twins together. Dobby clapped his hands over his bat ears and moaned, Ah, speak not the same, speak not the name. Sorry, said Harry quickly. I know lots of people don't like it. My friend Ron, he stopped suddenly, a pained look coming over his face. Dobby leaned toward Harry, his eyes wide as headlights. Dobby heard tell, he said hoarsely, that Harry Potter met the Dark Lord for a second time, just weeks ago. That Harry Potter escaped it again. Harry nodded, and Dobby's eyes suddenly shone with tears. Ah, sir, he gasped, dabbing his face with a corner of the grubby pillowcase he was wearing. Harry Potter is valiant and bold. He has braved so many dangers already. But Dobby has come to protect Harry Potter and his sister, to warn them, even if Hedoshave to shut his ears in the oven door later. The Potters must not go back to Hogwarts. There was a silence broken only by the chink of knives and forks from downstairs and the distant rumble of Uncle Vernon's voice. It was at this point Crookshanks, Violet's very large, very orange cat, crawled out from beneath the bed and made himself known with a soft mew that did not match his enormous body at all. Violet immediately reached down and lifted the cat into her lap, where he began purring and sniffing at Dobby. The elf recoiled slightly. He and Crookshanks were nearly the same size. What? Harry stammered, sharing another look of confusion with his sister. But we've got to go back term stars on September 1st. It's all that's keeping us going. You don't know what it's like here. We don't belong here. We belong in your world at Hogwarts. No, 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 squeaked Dobby, shaking his head so hard his ears flapped. The Potters must stay safe where they are. They are too great, too good to lose. If the Potters go back to Hogwarts, they will be in mortal danger. Why? Said Violet in surprise. There is a plot, Violet Potter. A plot to make most terrible things happen at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry this year, whispered Dobby, suddenly trembling all over. Dobby has known it for months, ma'am. The Potters must not put themselves in peril. You are too important. What terrible things, said Harry at once. Who's plotting them? Dobby made a funny, choking noise and then banged his head frantically against the wall. All right, cried Violet, grabbing the elf's arm to stop him. You can't tell us, we understand, but why are you warning us? A sudden, unpleasant thought struck her. Hang on, this hasn't got to do with sorry with you-know-who, has it? You could just shake or nod, she added hastily, as Dobby's head tilted worryingly close to the wall again. Slowly, Dobby shook his head. Not Narth, who must not be named, ma'am, but Dobby's eyes were wide, and he seemed to be trying to give the twins a hint. However, they were completely lost. He hasn't got a brother, has he? Said Harry. Dobby shook his head, his eyes wider than ever. Well then, I can't think who else would have a chance of making horrible things happen at Hogwarts, Harry said. I mean, there's Dumbledore. For one thing, you know who Dumbledore is, don't you? Dobby bowed his head. Albus Dumbledore is the greatest headmaster Hogwarts has ever had. Dobby knows it, so Dobby has heard Dumbledore's powers rival those of he, who must not be named at the height of his strength. But, sir, Dobby's voice dropped to an urgent whisper, there are powers Dumbledore doesn't. Powers no decent wizard. And before either of them could stop him, Dobby bounded off the bed, seized the desk lamp, and started beating himself around the head with ear-splitting yelps. A sudden silence fell downstairs. 2 seconds later, the twins, hearts thudding madly, heard Uncle Vernon coming into the hall, calling, Dudley must have left his television on again, the little tyke. Quick. In the closet, hissed Violet, stuffing Dobby in, shutting the door, and flinging herself onto the bed just as the door handle turned. "What the devil are you doing?" said Uncle Vernon through gritted teeth, glaring between the twins with his hateful little eyes. "You've just ruined the punchline of my Japanese golfer joke. One more sound and you'll wish you'd never been born." He stomped flat-footed from the room. Violet stayed frozen on the bed. Shaking, Harry let Dobby out of the closet. "See what it's like here," he said. "See why we've got to go back to Hogwarts. It's the only place we've got, well, I think we have got friends." "Friends who don't even write to the Potters," said Dobby slyly. Violet's eyes narrowed. "How do I know our friends haven't been writing to us?" Dobby shuffled his feet. "The Potters mustn't be angry with Dobby. Dobby did it for the best. Have you been stopping our letters?" Harry hissed. "Dobby has them here, sir," said the elf. Stepping nimbly out of the twins' reach, he pulled a thick wad of envelopes from the inside of the pillowcase he was wearing. Violet could make out Hermione Granger's neat writing, Cassius, blocky scrawl, and even a scribble that looked as though it was from the Hogwarts gamekeeper Hagrid. Dobby blinked anxiously up at them. The Potters mustn't be angry, Dobby hoped. If the Potters thought their friends had forgotten them, the Potters might not want to go back to school. Violet's ears were ringing, but it was Harry who moved first. He made a grab for the letters, but Dobby jumped out of his reach. "Harry Potter will have them, sir, if he gives Dobby his word that he will not return to Hogwarts, and Violet Potter, too. Ah, this is a danger you must not face. Say you won't go back, sir." "No," said Harry angrily. "Give us our friends' letters." "Then the Potters leave Dobby no choice," said the elf sadly. Before either of them could move, Dobby had darted to the bedroom door, pulled it open, and sprinted down the stairs. Mouths dry, stomachs lurching, the twins sprang after him, trying not to make a sound. Harry jumped the last 6 steps and landed cat-like on the hall carpet, while Violet slid noiselessly down the wooden banister, looking around for Dobby. From the dining room, they heard Uncle Vernon saying, "Tell Petunia that very funny story about those American plumbers, Mr. Mason. She's been dying to hear." Violet tiptoed toward the laundry room while Harry ran up the hall into the kitchen. She looked frantically for any sign of the tiny elf, but there was neither hide nor hair of the little creature. Then, from the kitchen, there came a heart-stopping crash. Violet flattened herself against the wall and froze where she stood, listening to the shrieks of Aunt Petunia and Mrs. Mason, as well as the angry muttering of Uncle Vernon. Peering down the hall, she could just barely see Harry, covered in splatters of cream, having a mop and bucket shoved into his fumbling hands. Violet had just started creeping back upstairs to the safety of their bedroom when there was another shriek from the dining room, followed by frantic footsteps running toward the door. Uncle Vernon was stomping to the kitchen when he caught sight of Violet, immobile in the hallway, and let out a mad roar. "Get in here, girl," he hissed evilly, branding a letter in his purple fist. "Read it, both of you." Violet, who had no idea where the letter had even come from, took it with a shaking hand and began to read aloud. It did not contain birthday greetings. "Dear Mr. and MS. Potter, we have received intelligence that a hover charm was used at your place of residence this evening at 12 minutes past 9. As you know, underage wizards and witches are not permitted to perform spells outside school, and further spellwork on your part may lead to expulsion from said school. Decree for the reasonable restriction of underage sorcery, 1875, paragraph C. We would ask you to remember that any magical activities that risks notice by members of the non-magical community, Muggles, is a serious offense under Section 13 of the International Confederation of Warlocks Statute of Secrecy. Enjoy your holidays. Yours sincerely, Mafilda Hopkirk. Improper use of magic office Ministry of Magic. Violet looked up from the letter and gulped. "You didn't tell us you weren't allowed to use magic outside school," said Uncle Vernon, a mad gleam dancing in his eyes. "Forgot to mention it." "Slipped your minds, I dare say." He was bearing down on Violet like a great bulldog, all his teeth bared. "Well, I've got news for you, girl. I'm locking you both up. You're never going back to that school, never. and if you try and magic yourselves out, they'll expel you." And laughing like a maniac, he dragged Harry and Violet back upstairs. Uncle Vernon was as bad as his word. The following morning, he paid a man to fit bars on Harry and Violet's window. He himself fitted a cat flap in the bedroom so that small amounts of food could be pushed inside 3 times a day, with a piece of hard plastic kept over it the rest of the time to prevent Crookshanks from wandering the house. They let the twins out to use the bathroom in the morning and evening. Otherwise, they were locked in their room around the clock. 3 days later, the Dursleys were showing no signs of relenting, and neither Violet nor Harry could see any way out of this situation. They lay on their bed, watching the sinking behind the bars on the window, and wondered miserably what was going to happen to them. What was the point of magicking themselves out of the room if Hogwarts would expel them for doing it? Yet life at Privet Drive had reached an all-time low. Now that the Dursleys knew they weren't going to wake up as fruit bats, the twins had lost their own weapon. Dobby might have saved them from horrible things happening at Hogwarts, but the way things were going, they'd probably starve to death anyway. The cat flap rattled and Aunt Petunia's hand appeared, pushing a bowl of canned soup into the room. Violet, whose insides were aching with hunger, jumped off the bed and seized it. The soup was stone cold, but she drank half of it one gulp. The other half went to Harry to drink just as hungrily. With the broth gone, they picked through the remaining soggy meat and veggies and divvied them up between their pet's meat to Crookshanks, veg to Hedwig. Both animals looked at their meals with deep disgust. "It's no good turning your nose up at it," Violet told her cat grimly. "That's all we've got." She put the empty bowl back on the floor next to the cat flap and lay back down on the bed, somehow even hungrier than she had been before. "Supposing we're alive in another 4 weeks," said Harry, his head down at the other end of the bed near Violet's feet. "What do you suppose will happen if we don't turn up at Hogwarts? Will they send someone to see why I didn't come back? Would they be able to make the Dursleys let us go?" "They'll never let us go," Violet said bitterly. Harry was silent after that. The room was growing dark. Exhausted, stomachs rumbling, minds spinning over the same unanswerable questions, Harry and Violet fell into an uneasy sleep. Violet dreamed fitfully of the same visions that haunted her since early childhood, a man and woman screaming, a chaotic flurry of shapes and colors passing by her before she could process what they were meant to be. Tonight she dreamed of a door slamming behind her, a pair of hands that weren't her own locking it frantically, only for someone on the other side to grab the handle and rattle it, pounding to get it. "Stop it," Violet muttered as the pounding beat through her sore head. "Get away from me." Something solid hit her hard on the leg. She opened her eyes. Moonlight was shining through the bars on the window, and through the shape of Harry pressed against the glass, Violet could see a familiar, freckled face goggling back at them. Ron Weasley was outside of their window. Chapter 3. The Burrow. "Ron," breathed Harry, pushing the window up so they could talk through the bars as Violet scrambled to his side. "Ron, how did you what the—" Violet's mouth fell open as the full impact of what she was seeing hit here. Ron was leaning out of the back window of an old turquoise car, which was pocketed in midair. Grinning at Harry and Violet from the front seat were Fred and George, Ron's elder twin brothers. "All right, Violet?" asked George. "What's been going on?" said Ron, speaking to Harry. "Why haven't you been answering my letters? I've asked you to stay about 12 times, and then Dad come home and said you got an official warning for using magic in front of Muggles. It wasn't me, and how did he know?" "He works for the Ministry," said Ron. "You know we are not supposed do spells outside school. You should talk," said Violet, staring at the floating car. "Oh, this doesn't count," said Ron. "We're only borrowing this. It's Dad's, wedded and enchanted. But doing magic in front of those Muggles you live with. I told you. We didn't, but it'll take too long to explain now. Look. Can you tell them at Hogwarts that the Dursleys have locked us up and won't let us come back? And obviously we can't magic ourselves out, because the Ministry'll think that's the second spell we've done in 3 days. So, stop gibbering," said Ron. "We've come to take you home with us." But you can't magic us out either. We don't need to, said Ron, jerking his head toward the front seat and grinning. You forgot who I've got with me. Tie that around the bars, said Fred, throwing the end of a rope to Violet. If the Dursleys wake up, we're dead, said Violet, as she tied the rope tightly around a bar, and Fred revved up the car. Don't worry, said Fred, and stand back. Violet and Harry moved back into the shadows next to Hedwig, who seemed to have realized how important this was and kept still and silent. Violet scooped Crookshanks into her arms and held him close. The car revved louder and louder, and suddenly, with a crunching noise, the bars were pulled clean out of the window as Fred drove straight up in the air. The twins ran back to the window to see the bars dangling a few feet above the ground. Panting, Ron hoisted them up into the car. Violet listened anxiously, but there was no sound from the Dursleys' bedroom. When the bars were safely in the back seat with Ron, Fred reversed as close as possible to the window. Get in, Ron said. But all our Hogwarts stuff, said Violet. Our wands, my broomstick, where is it? Locked in the cupboard under the stairs, and we can't get out of this room, no problem, said George from the front passenger seat. Out of the way, you two. Fred and George climbed cat-like through the window into the twins' room. You had to hand it to them, thought Violet, as George took an ordinary hairpin from his pocket and started to pick the lock. A lot of wizards think it's a waste of time, knowing this sort of muggle trick, said Fred, but we feel their skills worth learning, even if they're a bit slow. There was a small click, and the door swung open. So we'll get your trunks, you grab anything you need from your room, and hand it to Ron, whispered George. Watch out for the bottom stair, it creaks, Violet whispered back, as the Weasley twins disappeared onto the dark landing. Harry and Violet dashed around their room, collecting their things and passing them out of the window to Ron Crookshanks, disliking all the manhandling, leapt into the car without any help and landed squarely in Ron's lap. Then they went to help Fred and George heave their trunks up the stairs. Violet heard Uncle Vernon cough. At last, panting, they reached the landing, then carried the trunks through the bedroom to the open window, Harry and Fred carrying his, while Violet helped George carry hers. Fred climbed back into the car to pull with Ron, and Harry and George pushed from the bedroom side. Inch by inch, each trunk slid through the window. Uncle Vernon coughed again. A bit more, panted Fred, who was pulling Violet's trunk from inside the car. One good push, Harry and George threw their shoulders against the trunk, and it slid out of the window and into the back seat of the car. Okay, let's go, George whispered. He helped Violet through the window before following himself. But as Harry climbed onto the windowsill, there came a sudden, loud screech from behind them, followed immediately by the thunder of Uncle Vernon's voice. That ruddy owl! I've forgotten Hedwig. Harry tore back across the room as the landing light clicked on. He snatched up Hedwig's cage, dashed to the window, and passed it out to Ron. He was scrambling back onto the chest of drawers when Uncle Vernon hammered on the unlocked door and it crashed open. For a split second, Uncle Vernon stood framed in the doorway. Then he let out a bellow like an angry bull and dived at Harry, grabbing him by the ankle. Ron, Violet, and George seized Harry's arms and pulled as hard as they could. Petunia, roared Uncle Vernon. They're getting away. They're getting away. Put your foot down, Fred, yelled Ron, his fist firmly clenched around a handful of Harry's shirt. The car shot forward suddenly, ripping Harry out of Uncle Vernon's grasp. They slammed the door shut behind him, and that was it. Violet couldn't believe it. They were free. She rolled down the window, the night air whipping her hair, and looked back at the shrinking rooftops of Privet Drive. Uncle Vernon, Aunt Petunia, and Dudley were all hanging, dumbstruck, out of the window. See you next summer, Violet yelled. The Weasleys roared with laughter, and the Potter twins settled back into their seats, grinning from ear to ear. Let Hedwig out, Harry told Ron. She can fly behind us. She hasn't had a chance to stretch her wings for ages. George handed the hairpin to Ron, and a moment later, Hedwig soared joyfully out of the window to glide alongside them like a ghost. So what's the story, Harry? Said Ron impatiently. What's been happening? Harry and Violet told them all about Dobby, the warning he'd given them, and the fiasco of the pudding. There was a long, shocked silence when they'd finished. "Very fishy," said Fred finally. "Definitely dodgy," agreed George. "So he wouldn't even tell you who's supposed to be plotting all this stuff?" "I don't think he could," said Violet. "I told you, every time he got close to letting something slip, he started banging his head against the wall." She saw Fred and George look at each other. "What, you think he was lying to us?" said Violet. "Well," said Fred, "put it this way, house elves have got powerful magic of their own, but they can't usually use it without their master's permission. I reckon old Dobby was sent to stop you coming back to Hogwarts. Someone's idea of a joke. Can you think of anyone at school with a grudge against the two of you?" "Yes," said Harry and Violet together, instantly. "Draco Malfoy," explained Harry. "He hates us." "Draco Malfoy," said George, turning around. "Not Lucius Malfoy's son." "Must be it's not a very common name, is it?" said Violet. "Why? I've heard Dad talking about him," said George. "He was a big supporter of you-know-who." "And when you-know-who disappeared," said Fred, craning around to look at the twins, "Lucius Malfoy came back saying he'd never meant any of it. Load of dung, Dad reckons. He was right in you-know-who's inner circle." Violet and Harry had heard these rumors about Malfoy's family before and weren't surprised by them at all. Malfoy made Dudley look like a kind, thoughtful, and sensitive boy. "I don't know whether the Malfoys own a house elf," said Violet. "Well, whoever owns him will be an old wizarding family, and they'll be rich," said Fred. "Yeah, Mum's always wishing we had a house elf to do the ironing," said George. "But all we've got is a lousy old ghoul in the attic and gnomes all over the garden. House elves come with big old manors and castles and places like that. You wouldn't catch one in our house." Harry and Violet were silent. Judging by the fact that Draco Malfoy usually had the best of everything, his family was rolling in wizard gold. They could just see Malfoy strutting around a large manor house. Sending the family servant to stop them from going back to Hogwarts sounded exactly like the sort of thing Malfoy would do. Had they been stupid to take Dobby seriously? "I'm glad we came to get you anyway," said Ron. "I was getting really worried when you didn't answer any of my letters. I thought it was Errol's fault at first." "Who's Errol?" "Our owl. He's ancient. It wouldn't be the first time he'd collapsed on a delivery. So then I tried to borrow Hermes." "Who?" "The own Mum and Dad bought Percy when he was made prefect," said Fred from the front. "But Percy wouldn't lend him to me," said Ron. "Said he needed him." "Percy's been acting very oddly this summer," said George, frowning. "And has been sending a lot of letters and spending a load of time shut up in his room. I mean, there's only so many times you can polish a prefect badge. You're driving too far west, Fred," he added, pointing at a compass on the dashboard. Fred twiddled the steering wheel. "So does your dad know you've got the car?" said Harry, looking as though he already knew the answer. No," said Ron. "He had to work tonight. Hopefully we'll be able to get it back in the garage without Mum noticing we flew it." "What does your dad do at the Ministry of Magic, anyway?" asked Violet. "He works in the most boring department," said Ron. "The misuse of Muggle artifacts office. Thuhat. It's all to do with bewitching things that are Muggle-made, you know, in case they end up back in a Muggle shop or house. Like last year, some old witch died, and her tea set was sold to an antiques shop. This Muggle woman bought it, took it home, and tried to serve her friends tea in it. It was a nightmare. Dad was working overtime for weeks." "What happened?" Violet asked, fascinated. "The teapot went berserk and squirted boiling water all over the place, and one man ended up in hospital with the sugar tongs clamped to his nose. Dad was going frantic. It's only him and an old warlock called Perkins in the office, and they had to do memory charms and all sorts of stuff to cover it up. But your dad, this car," Fred laughed. "Yeah, Dad's crazy about everything to do with Muggles. Our shed's full of Muggle stuff. He takes it apart, puts spells on it, and puts it back together again. If he raided our house, he'd have to put himself under arrest. It drives Mum mad." "That's the main road," said George, peering down through the windshield. We'll be there in 10 minutes. Just as well it's getting light. A faint pinkish glow was visible along the horizon to the east. Fred brought the car lower, and Violet saw a dark patchwork of fields and clumps of trees. "We're a little way outside the village," said George. "Utter recent, catchable." Lowers and lower went the flying car. The edge of a brilliant red sun was now gleaming through the trees. "Touchdown," said Fred, as with a slight bump they hit the ground. They had landed next to a tumble-down garage in a small yard, and Harry and Violet looked out for the first time at the Weasleys' house. It looked as though it had once been a large stone pigpen, but extra rooms had been added here and there, until it was several stories high, and so crooked that it looked as though it were held up with magic, which, Violet reminded herself, it probably was. 4 or 5 chimneys were perched on top of the red roof. A lopsided sign stuck in the ground near the entrance read, "The Burrow." Around the front door lay a jumble of rubber boots and a very rusty cauldron. Several fat brown chickens were pecking their way around the yard. "It's not much," said Ron. "It's wonderful," said the twins together happily, thinking of Privet Drive. They got out of the car. "Now we'll go upstairs really quietly," said Fred, "and wait for Mum to call us for breakfast. Then, Ron, you come bounding downstairs going, 'Mum, look who turned up in the night.' And she'll be all pleased to see Harry and Violet, and no one need ever know we flew the car." "Right," said Ron. "Come on, I sleep at the top." Ron had gone a nasty greenish color, his eyes fixed on the house. The others wheeled around. Mrs. Weasley was marching across the yard, scattering chickens, and for a short, plump, kind-faced woman, it was remarkable how much she looked like a saber-toothed tiger. "Ah," said Fred. "Oh, dear," said George. Mrs. Weasley came to a halt in front of them, her hands on her hips, staring from one guilty face to the next. She was wearing a flowered apron with a wand sticking out of the pocket. "So," she said. "Morning, Mum," said George, in what he clearly thought was a jaunty, winning voice. "Have you any idea how worried I've been?" said Mrs. Weasley in a deadly whisper. "Sorry, Mum, but see, we had to. All 3 of Mrs. Weasley's sons were taller than she was, but they cowered as her rage broke over them. Bed's empty, no note. Car Garnicud have crashed out of my mind with worried you care. Never, as long as I've lived you wait until your father gets home. We've never had trouble like this from Bill or Charlie or Percy. Perfect Percy," muttered Fred. "You could do with taking a leaf out of Percy's book," yelled Mrs. Weasley, prodding a finger in Fred's chest. "You could have deed, you could have been seen, you could have lost your father his job." It seemed to go on for hours. Mrs. Weasley had shouted herself hoarse before she turned on the twins, who backed away. "I'm very pleased to see you, Harry, Violet dear," she said. "Come in and have some breakfast." She turned and walked back into the house, and Harry and Violet, after glancing nervously at Ron, who nodded encouragingly, followed her. The kitchen was small and rather cramped. There was a scrubbed wooden table and chairs in the middle, and Violet and Harry sat on their edges of their seats. They had never been in a wizard house before. The clock on the wall opposite them had only one hand and no numbers at all. Written around the edge were things like time to make tea, time to feed the chickens, and you are late. Books were stacked 3 deep on the mantelpiece. Books with titles like Charm Your Own Cheese, Enchantment in Baking, and On Minute Feasts Its Magic. And unless Violet's ears were deceiving her, the old radio next to the sink had just announced that coming up was Witching House, with the popular singing sorceress, Celestina Warbeck. Mrs. Weasley was clattering around, cooking breakfast a little haphazardly, throwing dirty looks at her sons as she threw sausages into the frying pan. Every now and then she muttered things like, "Don't know what you were thinking of," and never would have believed it. "I don't blame you, dears," she assured Harry and Violet, tipping 7 or 8 sausages onto each of their plates. "Arthur and I have been worried about you too. Just last night, we were saying we'd come and get you ourselves if you hadn't written back to Ron by Friday. But really," she was now adding 3 fried eggs to their plates, "flying an illegal car halfway across the country, anyone could have seen you. She flicked her wand casually at the dishes in the sink, which began to clean themselves, clinking gently in the background. "It was cloudy, Mum," said Fred. "You better keep your mouth closed while you're eating," Mrs. Weasley snapped. "They were starving them, Mum," said George. "And you," said Mrs. Weasley, but it was with a slightly softened expression that she started cutting Violet's bread and buttering it for her. At that moment, there was a diversion in the form of a small, red-headed figure in a long nightdress, who appeared in the kitchen, gave a small squeal, and ran out again. "Ginny," said Ron in an undertone to Harry. "My sister. She's been talking about you all summer." "Yeah, she'll be wanting your autograph, Harry," Fred said with a grin, but he caught his mother's eye and bent his face over his plate without another word. Nothing more was said until all 5 plates were clean, which took a surprisingly short time. "Blimey, I'm tired," yawned Fred, setting down his knife and fork at last. "I think I'll go to bed, and you will not," snapped Mrs. Weasley. "It's your own fault you've been up all night. You're going to denome the garden for me. They're getting completely out of hand again. Oh, Mum, and you too," she said, glaring at Ron and George. "You can go up to bed, dears," she added to Violet and Harry. You didn't ask them to fly that wretched car, but the twins, who felt wide awake, said, "We'll help Ron. We've never seen a denoming. That's very sweet of you, dears, but it's dull work," said Mrs. Weasley. "Now, let's see what Lockhart's got to say on the subject," and she pulled a heavy book from the stack on the mantelpiece. George groaned. "Mum, we know how to denome a garden." Violet looked at the cover of Mrs. Weasley's book. Written across it in fancy gold letters were the words Gilderoy Lockhart's Guide to Household Pests. There was a big photograph on the front of a very good-looking wizard with wavy blonde hair and bright blue eyes. As always in the wizarding world, the photograph was moving. The wizard, who Violet supposed was Gilderoy Lockhart, kept winking cheekily up at them all. Mrs. Weasley beamed down at him. "Oh, he is marvelous," she said. "He knows his household pests all right. It's a wonderful book." "Mumph and Sisham," said Fred, in a very audible whisper. "Don't be ridiculous, Fred," said Mrs. Weasley, her cheeks rather pink. "All right, if you think you know better than Lockhart, you can go and get on with it, and woe betide you if there's a single gnome in that garden with I come out to inspect it." Yawning and grumbling, the Weasleys slouched outside with the Potters behind them. The garden was large, and in Violet's eyes, exactly what a garden should be. Aunt Petunia wouldn't have liked it. There were plenty of weeks, and the grass needed cutting, but there were gnarled trees all around the walls, plants Violet had never seen spilling from every flower bed, and a big green pond full of frogs. "Muggles have garden gnomes too, you know," Harry told Ron as they crossed the lawn. "Yeah, I've seen those things they think are gnomes," said Ron, bent double with his head in a peony bush, like fat little Santa Clauses with fishing rods. There was a violent scuffling noise. The peony bush shuddered, and Ron straightened up. "Thissy's a gnome," he said grimly. Jer off me," squealed the gnome. It was certainly nothing like Santa Claus. It was small and leathery-looking, with a large, knobby, bald head exactly like a potato. Ron held it at arm's length as it kicked at him with its horny little feet. He grasped it around the ankles and turned it upside down. "This is what you have to do," he said. He raised the gnome above his head, "Jer off me," and started to swing it in great circles like a lasso. Seeing the shocked looks on the twins' faces, Ron added, "It doesn't hurt them, you've just got to make them really dizzy so they can't find their way back to the gnome holes." He let go of the gnome's ankles. It flew 20 feet into the air and landed with a dull thud in the field over the hedge. "Pitiful," said Fred. "I bet I can get mine beyond that stump." Violet learned quickly not to feel too sorry for the gnomes. The first one Harry caught, he decided just to drop it over the hedge, but the gnome, sensing weakness, sank its razor-sharp teeth into Harry's finger, and he had a hard job shaking it off until, wow, Harry, that must have been 50 feet. The air was soon thick with flying gnomes. "See, they're not too bright," said George, seizing 5 or 6 gnomes at once. The moment they know the denoming's going on, they storm up to have a look. You'd think they'd have learned by now just to stay put. Soon, the crowd of gnomes in the field started walking away in a straggling line, their little shoulders hunched. "They'll be back," said Ron, as they watched the gnomes disappear into the hedge on the other side of the field. "They love it here. Dad's too soft with them. He thinks they're funny." "But why do you have to get rid of them?" Violet asked, feeling rather sad for the little creatures. "They tear up the garden," said George. He pointed to several small, muddy mounds of loose earth that had been pushed up from beneath. "Mum says they go after the chickens, too, but I've never seen it." Just then, the front door slammed. "He's back," said Fred. "Dad's home." They hurried through the garden and back into the house. Mr. Weasley was slumped in a kitchen chair with his glasses off and his eyes closed. He was a thin man, going bald, but the little hair he had was as red as any of his children's. He was wearing long green robes, which were dusty and travel-worn. "What a night," he mumbled, groping for the teapot as they all sat down around him. 9 raids, 9. And old Mundungus Fletcher tried to put a hex on me when I had my back turned. Mr. Weasley took a long gulp of tea and sighed. "Find anything, Dad," said Fred eagerly. "All I got were a few shrinking door keys and a biting kettle," yawned Mr. Weasley. "There was some pretty nasty stuff that wasn't my department, though. Mortlake was taken away for questions about some extremely odd ferrets, but that the Committee on Experimental Charms, thank goodness." "Why would anyone bother making door keys shrink?" said George. "Just muggle baiting," sighed Mr. Weasley. "Sell them a key that keeps shrinking to nothing so they can never find it when they need it. Of course, it's very hard to convict anyone because no muggle would admit their keys keep shrinking. They'll insist they just keep losing it. Bless them, they'll go to any lengths to ignore magic, even if it's staring them in the face. But the things our lot have taken to enchanting, you wouldn't believe, like cars, for instance." Mrs. Weasley had appeared, holding a long poker like a sword. Mr. Weasley's eyes jerked open. He stared guiltily at his wife. "Sea cars, Marley dear." "Yes, Arthur cars," said Mrs. Weasley, her eyes flashing. Imagine a wizard buying a rusty old car and telling his wife all he wanted to do with it was take it apart to see how it worked, while Ariel was enchanting it to make it fly. Mr. Weasley blinked. "Well, dear, I think you'll find that he would be quite within the law to do that, even if he maybe would have done better to, tell his wife the truth. There's a loophole in the law, you'll find. As long as he wasn't intending to fly the car, the fact that the car could fly wouldn't. Arthur Weasley, you make sure there was a loophole when you wrote that law," shouted Mrs. Weasley. "Just so you could carry on tinkering with all that muggle rubbish in your shed. And for your information, Harry and Violet arrived this morning in the car you weren't intending to fly." "Harry," said Mr. Weasley blankly. "And Violet. Harry and Violet who?" He looked around, saw the twins and jumped. "Good Lord, is it the Potters?" "Very pleased to meet you both. Ron's told us so much about. Your sons flew that car to Surrey and back last night," shouted Mrs. Weasley. "What have you got to say about that, eh?" "Did you really?" said Mr. Weasley eagerly. "Did it go all right? I mean," he faltered as sparks flew from Mrs. Weasley's eyes. That was very wrong, boys, very wrong indeed." "Let's leave them to it," Ron muttered to Harry as Mrs. Weasley swelled like a bullfrog. "Come on, I'll show you my bedroom." Violet nervously watched them slip out of the kitchen, wondering if she was meant to follow along, when 2 pairs of arms looped around each of hers. "Come and see her bedroom," said Fred, grinning as they fairly lifted her away from the table. "We've been working on something could use an outside opinion." The twins led her out of the kitchen and down a narrow passageway to an uneven staircase, which wound its way, zigzagging up through the house. On the 4th landing, they made a show of leading her dramatically through a battered, slightly crooked doorway that bore several signs reading things like "Prank in Progress" and "Ginny, get out, it's for your own good." A small contraption beneath the window was glowing and emitting sparks at regular intervals. The walls were covered in diagrams and rude drawings and upside-down cutouts from Thedley Prophet. Even hanging from the ceiling were strange little devices, twitching and spinning seemingly on their own. Fred and George both scampered up onto the topmost bed with ease and sat, grinning, watching for Violet's reaction. "Have a seat," said Fred. "If you can find one," added George. And then together they said, "Make yourself at home." Violet, grinning widely, did just that. Chapter 4. Flu Travel. Life at the Burrow was as different as possible from life on Privet Drive. The Dursleys liked everything neat and orderly. The Weasleys' house burst with the strange and unexpected. Violet got a shock the first time she looked in the mirror over the kitchen mantelpiece, and it shouted, "Brush your hair, Scruffy." The ghoul in the attic howled and dropped pipes whenever it felt things were getting too quiet, and small explosions from Fred and George's bedroom were considered perfectly normal. Violet had even been present for some of them, much to her delight. What the Potter twins found most unusual about life at Ran's, however, wasn't the talking mirror or the clanking ghoul. It was the fact that everybody there seemed to like them. Mrs. Weasley fussed over the state of their clothes and tried to force them to eat 4th helpings at every meal. She also sat Violet down one night and went about combing the tangles and knots out of the rat's nest that was her hair and braided it back out of her face the way Violet liked. Unlike when Aunt Petunia did it, Violet did not go to bed in tears. Mr. Weasley liked Harry and Violet to sit on either side of him at the dinner table so that he could bombard them with questions about life with muggles, asking them to explain how things like plugs and the postal service worked. "Fascinating," he would say as Violet talked him through using a telephone. "Ingenious, really, how many ways muggles have found of getting along without magic." Violet and Harry heard from Hogwarts one sunny morning about a week after they had first arrived at the Burrow. While Harry was staying with Ron at the very top of the house, Violet had been sleeping on the 3rd floor in Ginny's bedroom. She and the Weasley twins had argued that there was plenty of room for her to stay with them, but Mrs. Weasley didn't think it would be proper. Sharing a room with Ginny wasn't terribly fun for Violet. The younger girl barely spoke to her, preferring instead to sit across from her on the other side of the room and stare with wide, mystified brown eyes. When she did talk, it was to ask odd questions about Harry. There was a small patch of wall completely devoted to Harry, much to Violet's alarm. Ginny had quickly covered it with a towel, but not before Violet had seen the many clippings from Thedley Prophet, a handful of simple drawings of him with hearts all around them, and what looked to be a note to Ron that her brother had passed to him in class. Violet, quickly annoyed with all the badgering, told Ginny that Harry snored and had very stinky feet. She and Violet were sitting at the breakfast table when Harry and Ron came down. The moment she saw Harry, Ginny accidentally knocked her porridge bowl to the floor with a loud clatter. Ginny seemed very prone to knocking things over whenever Harry entered a room. She dived under the table to retrieve the bowl and emerged with her face glowing like the setting sun. Violet rolled her eyes as Harry sat down beside her, clearly pretending not to have noticed. "Letters from school," said Mr. Weasley, passing Harry and Violet identical envelopes of yellowish parchment, addressed in green ink. "Dumbledore already knows you're here. You two doesn't miss a trick, that man. You two have got them, too," he added, as Fred and George ambled in, still in their pajamas. For a few minutes there was silence as they all read their letters. Violet told her to catch the Hogwarts Express as usual from King's Cross Station on September 1st. There was also a list of the new books she'd need for the coming year. Second-year students will require the Standard Book of Spells, Grade 2 by Miranda Goshawk Brake with a Banshee Gilderoy Lockhart, Gadding with Goolsby Gilderoy Lockhart, Holidays with Hagsby Gilderoy Lockhart, Travels with Trollsby Gilderoy Lockhart, Voyages with Vampiresby Gilderoy Lockhart, Wandering with Werewolvesby Gilderoy Lockhart, Year with the Yetiby Gilderoy Lockhart. Fred, who had finished his own list, peered over at Harry's. "You've been told to get all Lockhart's books too," he said. "The new defense against the dark arts teacher must be a fan bet it's a witch." At this point, Fred caught his mother's eye and quickly busied himself with the marmalade. "That lot won't come cheap," said George with a quick look at his parents. "Lockhart's books are really expensive." "Oh, well, we'll manage," said Mrs. Weasley, but she looked worried. "I expect we'll be able to pick up a lot of Ginny's things second-hand." "Oh, are you starting Hogwarts this year?" Harry asked Ginny. She nodded, blushing to the roots of her flaming hair, and put her elbow in the butter dish. Fortunately, no one saw this except Harry, because Violet was too busy rolling her eyes, and all the Weasleys were distracted by the sight of Ron's elder brother Percy walking in. He was already dressed, his Hogwarts prefect badge pinned to his sweater vest. "Morning, all," said Percy briskly. "Lovely day." He sat down in the only remaining chair, but leapt up again almost immediately, pulling from underneath him a molting grey feather duster at least. That was what Violet thought it as, until she saw that it was breathing. "Errol," said Ron, taking the limp owl from Percy and extracting a letter from under its wing. "Finally, he's got Hermione's answer. I wrote to her saying we were going to try and rescue you from the Dursleys." He carried Errol to a perch just inside the back door and tried to stand him on it, but Errol flopped straight off again, so Ron laid him on the draining board instead, muttering, "Pathetic." Then he ripped open Hermione's letter. "Dear Ron, and Harry if you're there. I hope everything went all right, and that Harry is okay, and that you didn't do anything illegal to get him out, Ron, because that would get Harry into trouble too. I've been worried, and if Harry is all right, will you please let me know at once? But perhaps it would be better if you used a different owl, because I think another delivery might finish your one off. I'm very busy with schoolwork, of course. How can you be?" said Ron in horror. "We're on vacation, and we're doing to London next Wednesday to buy my new books. Why don't we meet in Diagon Alley? Let me know what's happening as soon as you can. Love from Hermione." Harry was beaming, but Violet sat there with a strange sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach. Hermione hadn't asked after her at all, and in a moment of horror, Violet realized that she had never gotten around to sending word to Tracy or Cassius about what had happened to her over the summer. Judging from the state of the Weasleys' owl, she wouldn't get the chance now. "Well, that fits in nicely. We can go and get all your things then, too," said Mrs. Weasley, starting to clear the table. "What are you all up to today?" Harry, Ron, Fred, and George, and Violet, who was determined not to spend another day being stared at by Ginny, were planning to go up the hill to a small paddock the Weasleys owned. It was surrounded by trees that blocked it from view of the village below, meaning they could practice Quidditch there, as long as they didn't fly too high. They couldn't use real Quidditch balls, which would have been hard to explain if they had escaped and flown away over the village. Instead, they threw apples for one another to catch. They took turns riding Harry's Nimbus 2000, which was easily the best broom. Ron's old shooting star was often outstripped by passing butterflies. 5 minutes later, they were marching up the hill, broomsticks over their shoulders. They had asked Percy if he wanted to join them, but he had said he was busy. Violet had only seen Percy at mealtimes so far. He stayed shut in his room the rest of the time. "Wish I knew what he was up to," said Fred, frowning. "He's not himself." His exam results came the day before you did, 12 OWLS, and he hardly gloated at all. "Ordinary wizarding levels," George explained, seeing Violet's puzzled look. "Bill got 12 too. If we're not careful, we'll have another head boy in the family." I don't think I could stand the shame. Bill was the oldest Weasley brother. He and the next brother, Charlie, had already left Hogwarts. Harry and Violet had never met either of them, but knew that Charlie was in Romania studying dragons and Bill in Egypt working for the wizard bank, Gringotts. "Dunno how Mum and Dad are going to afford all our school stuff this year," said George after a while. "5 sets of Lockhart books, and Ginny needs robes and a wand and everything." "Can we help?" Violet asked, which prompted all 3 Weasleys to look at her. "We've got Harry and me, we've got some money our parents left us." The expressions on Ron, Fred, and George's face had become oddly closed, and Violet could feel herself blushing. She had overstepped. "That's very kind of you," George said after a moment, "but we'll manage." Violet sat quietly on the sidelines after that, watching the boys play together, feeling too awkward to join in again. She shouldn't have mentioned the money, but she was only trying to help. It wasn't her fault that her and Harry's mother and father had left behind a small fortune for them, all of it in wizard gold that couldn't even be used in muggle shops. She and Harry had never mentioned their Gringotts bank account to the Dursleys. They didn't think their horror of anything connected with magic would stretch to a large pile of gold. Mrs. Weasley woke them all early the following Wednesday. After a quick half a dozen bacon sandwiches each, they pulled on their coats, and Mrs. Weasley took a flower pot off the kitchen mantelpiece and peered inside. "We're running low, Arthur," she sighed. "We'll have to buy some more today. Ah, well, guests first. After you, Violet dear," and she offered her the flower pot. Violet stared at them all watching her. What am I supposed to do?" she stammered. "They've never traveled by Floo powder," said Ron suddenly. "Sorry, Violet, I forgot." "Never," said Mr. Weasley. "But how did you get to Diagon Alley to buy your school things last year?" "We went on the underground, really," said Mr. Weasley eagerly. "Were there escalators? How exactly?" "No, Arthur," said Mrs. Weasley. "Floo powder's a lot quicker, dear, but goodness me, if you've never used it before, they'll be all right, Mum," said Fred. "Watch us first." He took a pinch of glittering powder out of the flower pot, stepped up the fire, and threw the powder into the flames. With a roar, the fire turned emerald green and rose higher than Fred, who stepped right into it, shouted, "Diagon Alley," and vanished. "You must speak clearly, dears," Mrs. Weasley told them as George dipped his hand into the flower pot. "And be sure to get out at the right grate." "The right what?" said Violet nervously as the fire roared and whipped George out of sight too. "Well, there are an awful lot of wizard fires to choose from, you know, but as long as you've spoken clearly, they'll be fine, Marley, don't fuss," said Mr. Weasley, helping himself to some Floo powder too. "But dear, if they get lost, how will we ever explain to their aunt and uncle?" "They won't mind," Harry reassured her. "Dudley would think it was a brilliant joke if we got lost up a chimney. Don't worry about that." "Well, all right." "You go after Arthur, Violet dear," said Mrs. Weasley. "Now when you get into the fire, say where you're going and keep your elbows tucked in," Ron advised. "And your eyes shut," said Mrs. Weasley. "The soot, don't fidget," said Ron. "Or you might well fall out of the wrong fireplace. But don't panic and get out too early. Wait until you see Fred and George." Trying hard to bear all of this in mind, Violet took a pinch of Floo powder and walked to the edge of the fire. She took a deep breath, threw the powder into the flames, and stepped forward. The fire felt like a warm breeze. She sucked in a short, sharp breath through her teeth. "Diagon Alley," she shouted, a bit too loudly. It felt as though she were being sucked down a giant drain. She seemed to be spinning very fast. The roaring in her ears was deafening. She squeezed her eyes shut tight against the whirl of green flames. Something knocked her elbow, and she tucked it in tightly, still spinning and spinning. Now it felt as though cold hands were slapping her face, squinting through the flames. And soot, she saw a blurred stream of fireplaces, and snatched glimpses of the rooms beyond her bacon sandwiches were chirking inside as she caught a flash of red. Was it red hair? Violet lurched forward, falling face forward, and was caught immediately by two sets of hands under her armpits. "Hooray!" cried Fred, jostling her as he jumped up and down. "See," said George, grinning at her from above her right shoulder. "That wasn't so bad." Dizzy and feeling rather sick, Violet didn't dare open her mouth to disagree. They were standing in the cramped, dingy main room of the Leaky Cauldron, the ancient bartender nodding politely to them from behind the bar. There were even fewer patrons present today than the first time Violet had been here. Thankfully, none of them rushed up to shake her hand this time. "All right, Violet?" asked Mr. Weasley, smiling kindly at her. He had a large streak of soot across his chin that his sons had likely not told him about. "Fine, sir, thank you," said Violet. There was a sudden roaring from the fireplace, followed by a strong gust of hot air, and a moment later the small, red-headed form of Ginny Weasley popped out and ran straight into her father. Ron followed, cool and collected if a bit wobbly on his feet. Right after him came Percy, who wore an expression of forced composure as he strode out of the fire, and then, moments behind him, Mrs. Weasley, her hair fluttering wildly about her head as she stepped calmly out of the fireplace. The fire, once roaring high with flames, now settled to a gentle flicker. Violet felt her stomach drop. "Where's Harry?" she asked, looking around the pub as though she may have missed him somehow. Mrs. Weasley was busy brushing soot from the front of her robes and said, "He went right before Ginny, dear. He might be feeling a bit sick." "He's not here," said Ron suddenly, whirling around in alarm. "Mum, he didn't come out. We've all been standing here the whole time." They all looked around together, a pub full to bursting with Weasleys, and only one small, dark-haired figure standing amongst them. There was no sign of Harry. "Oh, good heavens," breathed Mrs. Weasley, her face white as a sheet. "Arthur," he coughed. "Arthur, going into the fire, you don't think?" Mr. Weasley had gone very pale as well, his face a grim mask of concentration. "We'll check the other shops," he said firmly. "I know a few other places connected to the flu network. He can't have missed too many stops." Violet wanted to believe that, but the worried looks Mr. and Mrs. Weasley gave each other didn't put her at ease at all. She wrapped her arms tight around herself, not knowing what else to do, and followed the Weasley family out into Diagon Alley in search of her twin. They darted in and out of shops, asking if anyone had come through the flu recently, only to be met with bewildered, shaking heads and dismissive waves. They decided it would be easier to split up. Mrs. Weasley took Ginny by the hand and marched off with her in one direction while Mr. Weasley and Ron headed in another, instructing Violet, Fred, and George to hurry on ahead and see if he might have come out further down the street. "Come on, we'll find him," said Fred gently when Violet began to cry. "Or he'll find us," added George. "He's clever, Harry, isn't he?" "He's not," said Violet, tears freely rolling down her cheeks now. "He's really stupid, and I can't believe he's done this." The twins got a good laugh out of that, at least. It was another frantic, gut-wrenching half an hour before they all reconvened outside of the white marble steps of the Wizard Bank Gringotts and ran into a familiar face. "Hermione," called Violet, at once recognizing the mass of thick brown curls heading up the steps. Hermione Granger looked around at the sound of her name and smiled broadly as Violet ran up to meet her. "Hello, Violet," said Hermione brightly. "Oh, I'm so glad you made it. Are you heading into Gringotts as well?" "Later," Violet said. She was suddenly aware of her own tear-stained face and flushed. "I have to find Harry first. He's gone missing." "Again," said Hermione, sounding surprised. "But I've only just seen him." She pointed over Violet's shoulder, down along the narrow street, and Violet caught sight of another achingly familiar figure standing head and shoulders above the rest. Bushy beard and hair and all, was Hagrid, the Hogwarts gamekeeper, and dwarfed beside him was Harry. Violet let out such a deep breath of relief that she went light-headed. "Harry," she said, and then shouted, "Harry!" Harry stood up on his tiptoes to see her as she sprinted toward him, shoving witches and wizards out of the way with the Weasleys' twins right behind her. Violet collided with her brother with such force he nearly lost his footing. "Stop doing this," Violet cried, nearly throttling him with her arms wrapped tight around his neck. "Stop getting yourself into trouble. You permitted me." "I didn't mean to," Harry grunted, though he was hugging her back just as fiercely. When Violet finally let go of him, he was all red in the face, covered in soot with his hair sticking up worse than usual and your glasses. "It's fine, Roman 6, Harry said, clearly embarrassed, but that didn't stop her from plucking the ruined metal frames from his face. Violet frowned at them. The bridge was nearly snapped in two, and there was a crack in one of the lenses, except whoa. Violet had blinked once. Where she once held a pair of dusty, mangled glasses, the set she held now was shiny and pristine. There were no bends or cracks, no streaks or bits of soot across the lenses. They were repaired, and Harry took them from her dumbstruck hands with his mouth hanging open. "Now I've ettled ye," burst Hagrid's voice from above, making them both jump. "Ye've got to get that under control." But I didn't do anything, said Violet, looking up into Hagrid's great hairy face. She had to squint slightly as the sun was behind him. Cardswallop, he huffed. But after a moment, his stern expression became soft, and Violet nearly crumpled under the force of a giant hand, giving her several hard pats on the top of the head. Good to see ye, Violet. I missed ye, the both of ye. Harry here was Juice, telling me about this business with the house. Elf and your letters, Harry. There was a great thundering of footsteps as Harry and Violet looked around. Sprinting up the crowded street were Ron, Fred, George, Percy, and Mr. Weasley. Harry, Mr. Weasley panted. We hoped you'd only gone one great too far. He mopped his glistening, bald patch. Marley's frantic, she's coming now. Where did you come out? Ron asked. Knockturn Alley, said Hagrid grimly. Excellent, said Fred and George together. We've never been allowed in, said Ron enviously. I should ruddy well think not, growled Hagrid. Mrs. Weasley now came galloping into view, her handbag swinging wildly in one hand, Ginny just clinging onto the other. Oh, Harry-o, my dear, you could have been anywhere, gasping for breath. She pulled a large clothes brush out of her bag and began sweeping off the fine layer of soot that coated Harry's clothes. Well, gotta be off, said Hagrid, who was having his hand wrung by Mr. Weasley, Knockturn Alley. If you hadn't found him, Hagrid, see you at Hogwarts. And he strode away, head and shoulders taller than anyone else in the packed street. Guess who I saw in Borgin and Burke's? Harry asked, as they all climbed the Gringotts step together. Hermione had waited at the bottom for them all and joined them. Malfoy and his father. Did Lucius Malfoy buy anything? Said Mr. Weasley sharply behind them. No, he was selling, so he's worried, said Mr. Weasley with grim satisfaction. Oh, I'd love to get Lucius Malfoy for something. You be careful, Arthur, said Mrs. Weasley sharply as they were bowed into the bank by a goblin at the door. That family's trouble. Don't go biting off more than you can chew. So you don't think I'm a match for Lucius Malfoy, said Mr. Weasley indignantly, but he was distracted almost at once by the sight of Hermione's parents, who were standing nervously at the counter that ran all along the great marble hall, waiting for Hermione to introduce them. Violet was distracted as well by the sight of a familiar chubby girl with many thick braids in her hair, each of them fastened at the end by a brightly colored clip. She was standing next to a tall, smartly dressed black man who could only be her father. Tracy, Violet blurted, staring in shock. Tracy Davis, her best friend in the world apart from Harry, whipped around so quickly she was hit in the face by her own hair, her face splitting into a great, brace-fitted grin as their eyes met. Violet, she shouted in delight. Ignoring the disapproving glares of the goblins behind the counter, the two girls raced toward one another and met in a fit of tight hugs and giggles. I can't believe you're here, Tracy exclaimed, jumping up and down on the marble floor. I thought I'd never see you again. I was so worried you never wrote back. And I thought you hated me, but y'ouldn't hate me, do you? Please say you don't hate me, Violet. I don't. I'm so sorry, Violet cried, and immediately launched into a muddled, condensed explanation of her miserable summer, Dobby the house elf, the pudding incident, the bars on the window. She was speaking very fast and knew she must not be making much sense, but Tracy listened in wonder as she spoke. And I thought my summer was wild, Tracy said at the end of it. One of my aunties has triplets, and I've been chief nanny ever since getting home. Oh, Violet. You haven't met my papa yet. Mr. Davis had a kind, crooked smile and politely shook Violet's hand, even though he had obviously been interrupted from his conversation with the Grangers. But Muggles, said Mr. Weasley delightedly. We must have a drink. What's that you've there? Oh, you're changing Muggle money. Marley, look. He pointed excitedly at the £10 note in Mr. Granger's hand. Have you got a vault? Asked Tracy, eyes wide as a goblin stepped from behind the counter and instructed them to follow him. Can I see it? The vaults were reached by means of small, goblin-driven carts that sped along miniature train tracks through the bank's underground tunnels. Violet enjoyed the breakneck journey down to the Weasleys' vault, but felt dreadful, far worse than she had after that awkward conversation with the twins, when it was opened. There was a very small pile of silver sickles inside, and just one gold galleon. Mrs. Weasley felt right into the corners before sweeping the whole lot into her bag. Violet felt even worse when they reached her and Harry's vault. The pair of them shared terribly guilty glances as they tried to block the contents from view, hastily shoving handfuls of coins into their small leather bags. Violet made eye contact with no one, but could feel Tracy's eyes on her all the way back to the surface. Back outside on the marble steps, they all separated. Percy muttered vaguely about needing a new quill. Fred and George had spotted their friend from Hogwarts, Lee Jordan. Mrs. Weasley and Ginny were going to a second-hand robe shop. Mr. Weasley was insisting on taking the Grangers and Mr. Davis off to the Leaky Cauldron for a drink. And of course, Harry had paired off with Ron and Hermione to wander the streets together. That left Tracy and Violet buzzing with excitement and a whole summer's worth of news to share, sent off to their own devices. "We'll all meet at Flourish and Blatt's in an hour to buy your school books," said Mrs. Weasley, setting off with Ginny. "And not one step down Knockturn Alley," she shouted at her twin sons' retreating backs. Violet and Tracy strolled off along the winding, cobbled street, chattering and comparing summer activities. Tracy was horrified to hear about Violet and Harry's treatment at the hands of the Dursleys, and altogether confused about their visit from Dobby the house elf and his grim, cryptic warnings of terrible danger to come should they return to Hogwarts. "I've never even heard of house elves," she said with a frown. "I don't think I like the sound of it, keeping another creature in your house to do what you say, then making them hurt themselves if they mess it up. But you're right about Malfoy probably owning one." "Hued, I bet." They wandered up the alley together, examining all the fascinating shop windows. Tracy gazed longingly at a full set of animated animal figurines, including a tiny crystal unicorn, and the pair of them took ages comparing pretty, speciality quills made of things like phoenix tail feather and the bright pink feather of something called a F-whooper. In Gamble and Jape's wizarding joke shop, they met Fred, George, and Lee Jordan, who were stocking up on Dr. Filibuster's fabulous wet start, no-heat fireworks, and in a tiny junk shop full of broken wands, lopsided brass scales, and old cloaks covered in potion, stains, Violet found herself a small, water-damaged book calidreedful Denizens of the Deep, which contained many detailed drawings of strange, frightening creatures that supposedly dwelled in the waters of the world. An hour later, they headed for Flourish and Blatt's. They were by no means the only ones making their way to bookshop. As they approached it, they saw to their surprise a large crowd jostling outside the doors, trying to get in. The reason for this was proclaimed by a large banner stretched across the upper windows. "Gilderoy Lockhart will be signing copies of his autobiography, Magical Me, today 12:30 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. Isn't he the man who wrote all our school books?" Tracy asked as they approached. The crowd seemed to be made up mostly of witches around Mrs. Weasley's age. A harassed-looking wizard stood at the door, saying, "Calmly, please, ladies. Don't push there. Mind the books now." One of the women, short and thin with a rather strong chin, was standing next to a young man with short, curly blonde hair, wearing an extremely bored expression and trying sneakily to move away from her. "Cassius!" Tracy yelled, sticking her hand up into the air and waving frantically. "Cass, look over here." The boy's head perked up, and a moment later he was grumbling and fussing and trying to squirm away from Violet and Tracy, who were both hugging him around the middle. "You've gotten taller," Violet said, having to look up now to see his face properly. He was blushing fiercely as he stiffly patted her on the arm. "Yeah, thanks for noticing, Violet. You look the same, really." "Are these your little friends, Cassie?" said the short woman standing beside him, who, judging by the accent, Violet realized must be his mother. Cassius' face went beet red. "They're not that little," he muttered. "Mother, this is Tracy D. Davis, and Violet Potter, Violet Potter." Mrs. Warrington smiled politely and shook both their hands, giving her son odd looks out of the corner of her eye as she did so. "Cassie has told me so much about you both," she said warmly. "And what a pleasure it is to meet you, Miss Potter, after all the stories I've heard." Violet smiled nervously, not quite sure how she felt about people hearing stories about her that she hadn't yet heard herself. She tried to catch Cassius' eye, but he was now busy staring at the ceiling while trying to shrink down into the collar of his shirt. "Have you got your books yet?" Tracy asked him. "Nope," said Cassius, still not looking at them. "Can't even get in the bloody shop." "Language, lad," said Mrs. Warrington sharply, and Violet thought Cassius might just die then, and there from all the blood rushing to his head. "I see my dad in there with Ron's parents," Tracy said, craning to look over the heads of all the middle-aged women crowding outside. "You could come stand with us if you like and cheat the line." "Nope," Cassius said. "We're fine here, thanks." A bead of sweat was trickling down his forehead. Violet and Tracy giggled as they left him to it, squeezing inside the bookshop under the arms of fawning women. The long line wound right to the back of the shop, where Gilderoy Lockhart was signing his books. They both grabbed a copy off the standard book of spells, grade 2, and sneaked up the line to where the Weasleys were standing with Mr. Davis and the Grangers. "Oh, there you are. Good," said Mrs. Weasley. She sounded breathless and kept patting her hair. "We'll be able to see him in a minute." Gilderoy Lockhart came slowly into view, seating at a table surrounded by large pictures of his own face, all winking and flashing dazzlingly white teeth at the crowd. The real Gilderoy was wearing robes of forget-me-not blue that exactly matched his eyes. His pointed wizard's hat was set at a jaunty angle on his wavy hair. A short, irritable-looking man was dancing around taking photographs with a large black camera that emitted puffs of purple smoke with every blinding flash. "Out of the way there," he snarled at Ron, moving back to get a better shot. "This is for Thedley Prophet. Big deal," said Ron, rubbing his foot where the photographer had stepped on it. Gilderoy Lockhart heard him. He looked up. He saw Ron, and then he saw Harry and Violet. He stared. Then he leapt to his feet and positively shouted, "It can't the Potter twins!" The crowd parted, whispering excitedly. Lockhart dived forward, seized Harry and Violet's arms, and pulled them to the front. The crowd burst into applause. Violet's face burned as Lockhart shook their hands for the photographer, who was clicking away madly, wafting thick smoke over the Weasleys. "Nice, big smiles, children," said Lockhart, through his own gleaming teeth. "Together, you and I are worth the front page." When he finally let go of their hands, Violet could hardly feel her fingers. They tried to sidle back over to the Weasleys, but Lockhart threw his arms around each of their shoulders and clamped them tightly to his sides like a pair of living, mortified bookends. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said loudly, waiting for quiet. "What an extraordinary moment this. The perfect moment for me to make a little announcement I've been sitting on for some time." When young Harry and Violet here stepped into Flourish and Blots today, they only wanted to buy my autobiography, which I shall be happy to present to them each now, free of charge. The crowd applauded again. "They had no idea," Lockhart continued, giving the twins a little shake that made Harry's glasses slip to the end of his nose, "that they would shortly be getting much more than my book, Magical Me. They and their schoolmates will, in fact, be getting the real Magical Me. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, I have great pleasure and pride in announcing that this September I will be taking up the post of defense against the dark arts teacher at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry." The crowd cheered and clapped, and the twins found themselves being presented with the entire works of Gilderoy Lockhart. Staggering slightly under their weight, they managed to make their way out of the limelight to the edge of the room. Harry tipped his books into Ginny's new cauldron, muttering about buying his own. "Bet you loved that, didn't you, Potter?" said a voice Violet, and Harry had no trouble recognizing. Draco Malfoy had sauntered over to them through the crowd, wearing his usual sneer. "Fey Mousebotters," said Malfoy. "Can't even go into a bookshop without making the front page." "Leave him alone. He didn't want all that," said Ginny. It was the first time she had spoken in front of Harry. She was glaring at Malfoy. "Potter, you've got yourself a girlfriend," drawled Malfoy. Ginny went scarlet as Ron and Hermione fought their way over, both clutching stacks of Lockhart's books. "Oh, it's you," said Ron, looking at Malfoy as if he were something unpleasant on the soul of his show. "Bet you're surprised to see Harry and Violet here, eh?" "Not as surprised as I am to see you in a shop, Weasley," retorted Malfoy. "I supposed your parents will go hungry for a month to pay for all those." "Go away, Malfoy," Violet snapped, but Ron had already dropped his books into the cauldron too and started toward Malfoy. Harry and Hermione grabbed the back of his jacket. "Ron," said Mr. Weasley, struggling over with Fred and George. "What are you doing? It's too crowded in here. Let's go outside." Well, Arthur Weasley. Appearing behind Draco was a man Violet immediately knew to be his father. He had the same pointed face and white blonde hair, and standing with his hand on his son's shoulder, the exact same sneer. "Lucius," said Mr. Weasley, nodding coldly. "Busy time at the ministry, I hear," said Mr. Malfoy. "All those raids. I hope they're paying you overtime." He reached into Ginny's cauldron and extracted, from amid the glossy Lockhart books, a very old, very battered copy of A Beginner's Guide to Transfiguration. "Obviously not," said Mr. Malfoy. "Dear me, what's the use of being a disgrace to the name of wizard if they don't even pay you well for it?" Mr. Weasley flushed darker than either Ron or Ginny. "We have a very differently idea of what disgraces the name of wizard, Malfoy," he said. "Clearly," said Mr. Malfoy, his pale eyes straying to the Grangers and Mr. Davis, who were watching apprehensively. "The company you keep, Weasley. And I thought your family could sink no lower." There was a thud of metal as Ginny's cauldron went flying. Mr. Weasley had thrown himself at Mr. Malfoy, knocking him backward into a bookshelf. Dozens of heavy spellbooks came thundering down on all their heads. There was a yell of, "Get him, Dad," from Fred or George. Mrs. Weasley was shrieking, "No, Arthur, no." The crowd stampeded backward, knocking more shelves over. "Gentlemen, please, please," cried the assistant, and then, louder than all, "Break it up, there, gents, break it up." Hagrid was wading toward them through the sea of books. In an instant, he had pulled Mr. Weasley and Mr. Malfoy apart. Mr. Weasley had a cut lip, but had paid Mr. Malfoy back for it, judging by the state of his bruised, squinting eye. He was still holding Ginny's old Transfiguration book. He thrust it at her, his eyes glittering with malice. "Here, girl, take your book. It's the best your father can give you." Pulling himself out of Hagrid's grip, he beckoned to Draco and swept from the shop. "You should have ignored him, Arthur," said Hagrid, almost lifting Mr. Weasley off his feet as he straightened his robes. "Rotten ter the core. The whole family, everyone knows that no Malfoy's worth listening ter bad blood. That's what it is. Come on now, let's get out of here." The assistant looked as though he wanted to stop them from leaving, but he barely came up to Hagrid's waist and seemed to think better of it. They hurried up the street, the Mr. Davis tight-lipped and the Grangers shaking with friend, and Mrs. Weasley beside herself with fury. "A fine example to set for your children, brawling in public. What Gilderoy Lockhart must have thought he was pleased," said Fred. "Didn't you hear him as we were leaving? He was asking that bloke from Thedley Prophet if he'd be able to work the fight into his report. Said it was all publicity. But it was a subdued group that headed back to the fireside in the leaky cauldron, where the Potters, the Weasleys, and all their shopping would be traveling back to the Burrow using flu powder. They said goodbye to the Grangers and Mr. Davis, who were leaving the pub for the Muggle Street on the other side. Mr. Weasley started to ask them how bus stops worked, but stopped quickly at the look on Mrs. Weasley's face. Violet watched Harry take off his glasses and put them safely in his pocket before helping himself to flu powder. She didn't relax until she heard him say, very clearly this time, "The Burrow." Chapter 5. The Whomping Willow. The end of the summer vacation came far too quickly for Harry and Violet's liking. They were looking forward to getting back to Hogwarts, but this month at the Burrow had been the happiest of their lives. It was difficult not to be jealous of Ron when they thought of the Dursleys and the sort of welcome the two of them could expect the next time they turned up on Privet Drive. On their last evening, Mrs. Weasley conjured up a sumptuous dinner that included all of the twins' favorite things, ending with a mouth-watering treacle pudding. Fred and George rounded off the evening with a display of filibuster fireworks. They filled the kitchen with red and blue stars that bounced from ceiling to wall for at least half an hour. Then it was time for a last mug of hot chocolate and bed. Once again, Mrs. Weasley took Violet aside and did her the favor of brushing out and braiding her hair before giving her a quick peck on the crown of the head and sending her off to Ginny's room. Violet, who had never been kissed by anyone before, fell asleep smiling. It took a long while to get started next morning. They were up at dawn, but somehow they still seemed to have a great deal to do. Mrs. Weasley dashed about in a bad mood looking for spare socks and quills. People kept colliding on the stairs, half-dressed with bits of toast in their hands, and Mr. Weasley nearly broke his neck, tripping over a stray chicken as he crossed the yard carrying Ginny's trunk to the car. Violet couldn't see how 9 people, 7 large trunks, 2 owls, a fat cat, and a rat were going to fit into one small Ford Anglia. She had reckoned, of course, without the special features that Mr. Weasley had added. "Not a word to Marley," he whispered to her and Harry as he opened the trunk and showed them how it had been magically expanded so that the luggage fit easily. When at last they were all in the car, Mrs. Weasley glanced into the back seat, where Harry, Ron, Fred, George, and Percy were all sitting comfortably side by side, and said, "Muggles know more than we give them credit for, don't they?" She ushered Violet and Ginny into the front seat with herself, which had been stretched so that it resembled a park bench. "I mean, you'd never know it was this roomy from the outside, would you?" Mr. Weasley started up the engine, and they trundled out of the yard, Violet turning back for a last look at the house. She had barely time to wonder when she'd see it again. When they were back, George had forgotten his box of filibuster fireworks. 5 minutes after that, they skidded to a halt in the yard so that Fred could run in for his broomstick. They had almost reached the highway when Ginny shrieked that she'd left her diary. By the time she had clambered back into the car, they were running very late and tempers were running high. Mr. Weasley glanced at his watch and then at his wife. "Marley, dear." "No, Arthur. No one would see this little button here is an invisibility booster I installed that get us up in the air, then we fly above the clouds. We'd be there in 10 minutes, and no one would be any the wiser." "I said no, Arthur, not in broad daylight." They reached King's Cross at 11:15. Mrs. Weasley dashed across the road to get trolleys for their trunks, and they all hurried into the station. Harry and Violet had taken the Hogwarts Express the previous year. The tricky part was getting onto platform 9 3/4, which wasn't visible to the Muggle eye. What you had to do was walk through the solid barrier dividing platforms 9 and 10. It didn't hurt, but it had to be done carefully so that none of the Muggles noticed you vanishing. "Percy first," said Mrs. Weasley, looking nervously at the clock overhead, which showed they had only 5 minutes to disappear casually through the barrier. Percy strode briskly forward and vanished. Mr. Weasley went next. Fred and George followed. "I'll take Ginny and you 3 come right after us," Mrs. Weasley told Harry, Ron, and Violet, grabbing Ginny's hand and setting off. In the blink of an eye they were gone. "Violet, you first." "Harry, let's go together. We've only got a minute," Ron said to the twins. Violet made sure that Crookshank's carrier was safely wedged on top of her trunk and wheeled her trolley around to face the barrier. She felt perfectly confident. This wasn't nearly as uncomfortable as using flu powder, and she'd already had plenty of practice walking through walls the previous year. Violet bent low over the handle of her trolley and walked purposefully toward the barrier, gathering speed. A few feet away from it, she broke into a run and crash. Her trolley hit the barrier and bounced backward. Violet was knocked off her feet, and Crookshank's carrier went crashing to the shiny floor, the poor cat yowling indignantly. People all around her stared, and a guard yelled, "What in blazes do you think you're doing?" "Lost control of the trolley," Violet gasped, clutching her ribs as Harry ran up to help her to her feet. Ron ran to pick up Crookshanks, who hissed and spit as soon as he got near him. "We can't get through," Violet hissed to Harry, but we have to." Ron looked around wildly. A dozen curious people were still watching them. "We're going to miss the train," Ron whispered. "I don't understand why the gateway sealed itself." Violet and Harry looked up at the giant clock with a sickening feeling in the pit of their stomachs. 10 seconds. 9 seconds. Harry wheeled his trolley forward cautiously until it was right against the barrier and pushed with all his might. The metal remained solid. 3 seconds. 2 seconds. 1 second. "It's gone," said Violet, still staring up the clock. Ron looked stunned. "The train's left." "What if Mum and Dad can't get back through to us? Have you got any muggle money?" Harry gave a hollow laugh. "The Dursleys haven't given us pocket money for about 6 years." Ron pressed his ear to the cold barrier. "Can't hear a thing," he said tensely. "What are we going to do?" "I don't know how long it'll take Mum and Dad to get back to us." They looked around. People were still watching them, mainly because of Crookshank's continual yowling. "I think we'd better go and wait by the car," said Violet. "We're attracting too much attention." "Violet," said Ron, his eyes gleaming. "The car. What about it? We can fly the car to Hogwarts." "Oh, Ron, no. We're stuck, right? And we've got to get to school, haven't we? And even underage wizards are allowed to use magic if it's a real emergency. Section 19 or something of the restriction thingy. But your mum and dad," said Harry, pushing against the barrier again, as if in the vain hope that it would give way. "How will they get home?" "They don't need the car," said Ron impatiently. "They know how to apparate, just vanish and reappear at home. They only bother with flu powder in the car because we're all underage and we're not allowed to apparate yet." Harry's mouth was curling into an excited smile, but Violet's stomach was still twisting itself into anxious knots. "I don't like this," she said, but the boys weren't paying attention to her anymore. "Can you fly it?" Harry asked as they wheeled their trolleys around to face the exit. "No problem," said Ron, grinning as well. "Come on, let's go. If we hurry, we'll be able to follow the Hogwarts Express." And they marched off through the crowd of curious muggles, out of the station and back onto the side of the road where the old Ford Anglia was parked. Ron unlocked the cavernous trunk with a series of taps from his wand. They heaved their luggage back in, put Hedwig and Crookshanks into the back, which is where Violet also chose to sat, while the boys took the front. She let Crookshanks out of his cramped cage and held him in her lap. She needed the comfort as much as he did. "Check that no one's watching," said Ron, starting the ignition with another tap of his wand. Harry stuck his head out of the window, and Violet turned round in her seat. Traffic was rumbling along the main road ahead, but their street was empty. "Okay," they said. Ron pressed a shiny silver button on the dashboard. The car around them vanished, and so did they. Violet could feel the seat vibrating beneath him, hear the engine, feel the cat on her knees, but all for all she could see, she had become a pair of eyeballs, floating a few feet above the ground in a dingy street full of parked cars. "Let's go," said Ron's voice from right in front of her. And the ground and the dirty building on either side fell away, dropping out of sight as the car rose. In seconds, the whole of London lay, smoky and glittering, below them. Then there was a popping noise, and the car, Violet, Harry, and Ron reappeared. "Uh-oh," said Ron, jabbing at the invisibility booster. "It's faulty." Both of the boys pummeled it. The car vanished. Then it flickered back again. "Hold on," Ron yelled, and he slammed his foot on the accelerator. They shot straight into the low, woolly clouds, and everything turned dull and foggy. "Now what?" said Violet, blinking at the solid mass of cloud pressing in on them from all sides. "We need to see the train to know what direction to go in," said Ron. "Dip back down again quickly." They dropped back beneath the clouds and twisted around in their seats, squinting at the ground. "I can see it," Harry yelled. Right ahead there, the Hogwarts Express was streaking along below them like a scarlet snake. "Due north," said Ron, checking the compass on the dashboard. "Okay, we'll just have to check on it every half an hour or so. Hold on." And they shot up through the clouds. A minute later, they burst out into a blaze of sunlight. It was a different world. The wheels of the car skimmed the seat of fluffy cloud, the sky a bright, endless blue under the blinding white sun. "All we've got to worry about now are airplanes," said Ron. They all looked at each other and started to laugh. For a long time, they couldn't stop. It was as though they had been plunged into a fabulous dream. This, thought Violet, was surely the only way to travel past swirls and turrets of snowy cloud, in a car full of hot, bright sunlight, with a fat pack of toffees in the glove compartment, and the prospect of seeing Fred's and George's jealous faces when they smoothly and spectacularly on the sweeping lawn in front of the Hogwarts castle. But thinking of Hogwarts made Violet's guts do more of their funny twisting. She was struck with an idea. "Harry," she said, climbing to rest her arms on the back of the front seats, "can I let Hedwig out? I think we should try to tell the school we're coming, even though we're not on the train, otherwise they might not let us in." "Write to Dumbledore," Harry suggested over the roar of the engine. "And tell him that Wetridto get through the barrier," added Ron. "Here, I think we've got some scratch paper in here." A few minutes later, Hedwig soared happily out the car window with a small, rolled-up note clenched in her beak. Violet sat back in her seat and went back to staring out the window. They made regular checks on the train as they flew farther and farther north, each dip beneath the clouds showing them a different view. London was soon far behind them, replaced by neat green fields that gave way and turned to wide, purplish moors, a great city alive with cars like multicolored ants, villages with tiny toy churches. There was a bit of a kerfuffle during the afternoon when Ron's pet rat, Scabbers, decided to crawl up out of Ron's pocket and take in the view from the perch of Ron's shoulder. Crookshanks almost immediately pounced. "Get him off," Ron yelped, as the cat's sharp claws sank into the back of his neck. Scabbers leapt desperately across the seated Harry, who caught him the way one would catch a hot potato, and Violet only just managed to grab Crookshanks round the middle before he could maul her brother as well. "I've told you no," she scolded, wrapping both arms round the struggling cat and holding him against her chest. "Crookshanks, stop it. You can't eat him." "That thing's a monster," snarled Ron, rubbing at the fresh scratches on his back. Violet swelled indignantly. "He's only a cat," she snapped, trying to pet Crookshanks enough to make him stop growling. "It's not like he can help it, Ron." The two of them glared silently at each other in the rearview mirror while Harry tried to make peace, holding Scabbers well out of Crookshank's sight until everyone had calmed down. Violet ran her hands through her cat's thick, orange fur, muttering kind things to him. Several uneventful hours later, however, the mood had not improved. The toffees had made them extremely thirsty, and they had nothing to drink. The three of them had all pulled off their sweaters, but Violet's blouse was sticking to the back of her seat, and she'd had to move Crookshanks off of her lap because he was making her far too hot. She had stopped noticing the fantastic cloud shapes now and was thinking longingly of the train miles below, where you could buy ice-cold pumpkin juice from a trolley pushed by a plump witch, and where her friends were surely wondering what had happened to her. Why hadn't they been able to get onto platform 9 3/4? "Can't be much farther, can it?" croaked Ron, hours later still, as the sun started to sink into the floor of cloud, staining it a deep pink. Ready for another check on the train. It was still right below them, winding its way past a snow-capped mountain. It was much darker beneath the canopy of clouds. Ron put his foot on the accelerator and drove them upward again, but as he did so, the engine began to whine. Harry and Violet exchanged nervous glances. "It's probably just tired," said Ron. "It's never been this far before." The three of them pretended not to notice the whining growing louder and louder as the sky became steadily darker. Stars were blossoming in the blackness. Violet pulled her sweater back on the same one Mrs. Weasley had knitted her for Christmas the year, before trying to ignore the way the windshield wipers were now waving feebly, as though in protest. "Not far," said Ron, more to the car than to the twins. "Not far now," and he patted the dashboard nervously. When they flew back beneath the clouds a little while later, they had to squint through the darkness for a landmark they knew. "There!" Harry shouted, making Ron and Violet jump. Straight ahead, silhouetted on the dark horizon, high on the cliff over the lake, stood the many turrets and towers of Hogwarts Castle. But the car had begun to shudder and was losing speed. "Come on," Ron said cajolingly, giving the steering wheel a little shake. "Nearly there. Come on," the engine groaned. Narrow jets of steam were issuing from under the hood. Violet struggled to cram Crookshanks back into his carrier and found herself gripping the door beside her very hard as they flew toward the lake. The car gave a nasty wobble. Glancing out of her window, Violet saw the smooth, black, glassy surface of the water a mile below. Ron's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. The car wobbled again. "Come in," Ron muttered. They were over the lake. The castle was right ahead. Ron put his foot down. There was a loud clunk, a splutter, and the engine died completely. "Oh," said Ron into the silence. The nose of the car dropped. They were falling, gathering speed, heading straight for the solid castle wall. "Noo-hoo," Ron yelled, swinging the steering wheel around. They missed the dark stone wall by inches as the car turned in a great arc, soaring over the dark greenhouses, then the vegetable patch, and then out over the black lawns, losing altitude all the time. Ron let go of the steering wheel completely and pulled his wand out of his pocket. "Stop." "Stop," he yelled, whacking the dashboard and the windshield, Violet screaming at the top of her lungs. But they were still plummeting, the ground flying up toward them. "Watch out for that tree," Harry bellowed, lunging for the steering wheel, but too late. Crunch. With an ear-splitting bang of metal on wood, they hit the thick tree trunk and dropped to the ground with a heavy jolt. Steam was billowing from under the crumpled hood. Crookshanks was mewling loudly in terror. Violet couldn't half breathe, having had the wind knocked out of her by the rough landing. Directly in front of her, Ron let out a low, despairing groan. "Are you okay?" Harry said urgently. "My wand," said Ron in a shaky voice. "Look at my wand." It had snapped, almost in two. The tip was dangling limply, held on by a few splinters. Violet opened her mouth to say she was sure they'd be able to mend it up at the school, but she never even got started. At that very moment, something hit the opposite side of the car with the force of charging bull, sending her slamming hard into the door beside her, just as an equally heavy blow hit the roof. "What's happened?" Ron gasped, staring through the windshield, and Violet looked up just in time to see a branch as thick as a python smash into it. The tree they had hit was attacking them. Its trunk was bent almost double, and its gnarled boughs were pummeling every inch of the car it could reach. "Ow!" said Ron, as another twisted limb punched a large dent into his door. The windshield was now trembling under a hail of blows from knuckle-like twigs and branch as thick as a battering ram was pounding furiously on the roof, which seemed to be caving. "Run for it!" Ron shouted, throwing his full weight against the door. But next second, he had been knocked backward into Harry's lap by a vicious uppercut from another branch. "We're done for," he moaned as the ceiling sagged. But suddenly the floor of the car was vibrating. The engine had restarted. "Reverse!" Harry yelled, and the car shot backward. The tree was still trying to hit them. They could hear its roots creaking as it almost ripped itself up, lashing out at them as they sped out of reach. "That," panted Ron, "was close." "Well done, car." The car, however, had reached the end of its tether. With a series of sharp clunks, the doors flew open and Violet felt her seat tip sideways. Next thing she knew, she was sprawled on the damp ground with Ron face down beside her. Loud thuds told her that the car was ejecting their luggage from the trunk. Crookshank's carrier flew through the air and burst open. He peeled off across the dark lawn with a loud yowl, tail bushed out, as he sped toward the castle without a backward look. Then, dented, scratched, and steaming, the car rumbled off into the darkness, its rear lights blazing angrily. "Come back," Ron yelled after it, brandishing his broken wand. "Dad'll kill me." But the car disappeared from view with one last snort from its exhaust. "Can yow believe your luck?" said Ron miserably, bending down to pick up Scabbers. Of all the trees we could have hit, we had to get one that hits back. He glanced over his shoulder at the ancient tree, which was still flailing its branches threateningly. "Come on," said Violet wearily. "We'd better get up to the school." It wasn't at all the triumphant arrival they had pictures. Stiff, cold, and bruised, they seized the ends of their trunks and began dragging them up the grassy slope toward the great oak front doors. "I think the feast's already started," said Ron, dropping his trunk at the foot of the front steps and crossing quietly to look through a brightly lit window. "Hey, you two come and look, it's the sorting." Harry and Violet hurried over, and together they all peered in at the great hall. Innumerable candles were hovering in midair over 4 long, crowded tables, making the golden plates and goblets sparkle. Overhead, the bewitched ceiling, which always mirrored the sky outside, sparked with stars. Through the forest of pointed black Hogwarts hat, Violet saw a long line of scared-looking first-years filing into the great hall. Ginny was among them, easily visible because of her vivid Weasley hair. Meanwhile, Professor McGonagall, a bespectacled witch with her hair in a tight bun, was placing the famous Hogwarts sorting hat on a stool before the newcomers. Every year, this aged-old hat, patched, frayed, and dirty, sorted new students into the 4 Hogwarts houses: Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin. Violet well remembered putting it on exactly 1 year ago and waiting, petrified, for its decision as it muttered aloud in her ear. Her worst fears had been realized when the hat placed her in a house other than the one her brother had just been sorted into. Harry was a Gryffindor, and Violet was put into Slytherin, a house with a reputation for turning out more dark witches and wizards than any other, as Harry was so fond of reminding her. But she had ended up making fast friends in Slytherin that very night. A very small, mousy-haired boy had been called forward to place the hat on his head. Violet's eyes wandered past him to where Professor Dumbledore, the headmaster, sat watching the sorting from the staff table, his long silver beard and half-moon glasses shining brightly in the candlelight. Several seats along, Violet saw Gilderoy Lockhart, dressed in robes of aquamarine, and there at the end was Hagrid, huge and hairy, drinking deeply from his goblet. "Hang on," Harry muttered. "There's an empty chair at the staff table." "Where's Snape?" Professor Snape was Violet's head of house, and Harry's least favorite teacher. Violet was also willing to wager that Harry was Snape's least favorite student, although she hadn't had any trouble with him herself. Sarcastic and quick to find fault in even the simplest of projects, Snape taught potions and was disliked by most everyone outside of Slytherin. "Maybe he's ill," said Ron hopefully. Violet thwacked him on the arm. "Maybe he's left," said Harry, "because he's missed out on the defense against the dark arts job again." "Harry, that's not fair," Violet protested. "Or he might have been sacked," said Ron enthusiastically. "I mean, everyone hates him. Ron, stop." "Or maybe," said a very cold voice right behind them, "he's waiting to hear why you 3 didn't arrive on the school train." Violet spun around. There, in his black robes rippling in a cold breeze, stood Severus Snape. He was a thin man with very pale skin, a hooked nose, and rather greasy, shoulder-length black hair, and at this moment he was smiling in a way that told them all they were in very deep trouble. "Follow me," said Snape. Not daring to even look at each other, Violet, Ron, and Harry followed Snape up the steps into the vast, echoing entrance hall, which was lit with flaming torches. A delicious smell of food was wafting from the great hall, but Snape led them away from the warmth and light, down a narrow stone staircase that led into the dungeons. "In," he said, opening a door halfway down the cold passageway and pointing. They entered Snape's office, shivering. The shadowy walls were lined with shelves of large glass jars, in which floated all manner of fascinating, preserved things that, at any other time, Violet would have loved to get a closer look at. At the moment, all she wanted was for her teeth to stop chattering. The fireplace was dark and empty. Snape closed the door and turned to look at them. "So," he said softly, "the train isn't good enough for the famous Potter twins and their faithful sidekick, Weasley. Wanted to arrive with a bang, did we, children?" No, sir, Violet tried to explain desperately. It was the barrier at King's Cross. Silence, said Snape coldly, sending her shrinking back. He turned his attention to the boys. What have you done with the car? Ron gulped. This wasn't the first time Professor Snape had given Violet the impression of being able to read minds. But a moment later she understood, as Snape unrolled today's issue of Thievening Prophet. You were seen, he hissed, showing them the headline. Flying Ford Anglia mystifies Muggles. He began to read aloud. 2 Muggles in London, convinced they saw an old car flying over the post office tower. At noon in Norfolk, Mrs. Hetty Bayliss, while hanging out her washing, Mr. Angus Fleet of Peebles reported to police. 6 or 7 Muggles in all. I believe Urfather works in the misuse of Muggle artifacts office, he said, looking up at Ron with a sour smile on his face. Dear, dear, his own son. Violet felt as though she'd just been walloped in the stomach by one of the mad tree's larger branches. If anyone found out that Mr. Weasley had bewitched the car, they hadn't thought of that. I noticed, in my search of the park, that considerable damage seems to have been done to a very valuable Whomping Willow, Professor Snape went on. That tree did more damage to us than we, Ron blurted out. Silence, snapped Snape again. Most unfortunately, 2 of you are not in my house, and the decision to expel you does not rest with me. I shall go and fetch the people who have that authority. You will wait here. Harry and Ron were staring at each other, white-faced. As soon as the door slammed shut, Violet burst into tears. She didn't feel hungry anymore. She now felt extremely sick. Professor Snape was going to have them thrown out of school and shipped back to the Dursleys, back to the room with the bars on the window and the flap on the door, and they were never, ever going to see the light of day again. 10 minutes later, Professor Snape returned with Professor McGonagall accompanying him. Violet had seen Professor McGonagall angry on several occasions, but either she had forgotten just how thin her mouth could go, or she had never seen her this angry before. She raised her wand the moment she entered. Harry and Violet both flinched, but she merely pointed it at the empty fireplace where flames suddenly erupted. Sit, she said, and conjured 3 wooden chairs by the fire. Explain, she said, her glasses glinting ominously. Ron launched into the story, staring with the barrier at the station, refusing to let them through. So we had no choice, Professor. We couldn't get on the train. Why didn't you send us a letter by owl? I believe I have an owl, Professor McGonagall said coldly to Harry. But wedded, Violet said, her voice cracking painfully. She'd not been able to stop crying yet, and her eyes were aching. I sent Hedwig off with a letter to the school, but there was a knock on the office door, and Professor Snape, now looking more satisfied than ever, opened it. There stood the headmaster, Professor Dumbledore. Violet's whole body went numb. Dumbledore was looking unusually grave. He stared down his very crooked nose at them, and Violet found herself wishing they were all still being beaten up by the Whomping Willow. There was a long silence. Then Professor Dumbledore reached into the great sleeve of his robes and produced a small, weathered scroll of scratch paper that Violet recognized at once. I received this only moments ago, Professor Dumbledore said softly. It is unfortunate that it did not find its way to me sooner, or perhaps this situation could have been entirely avoided. He passed the note to Professor McGonagall, whose eyes darted quickly over the few short lines it contained. Violet knew exactly what it said. She had written it, after all. Professor Dumbledore, we couldn't make the train. The platform barrier wouldn't let us through, and we are alone. We're coming by car. Sorry for any trouble caused. Please don't worry. Violet Potter, with Harry Potter, Ron Weasley, Professor McGonagall's side, breathed heavily and handed the letter to Professor Snape, who frowned deeply as he read it over. Professor Dumbledore was still staring at the 3 of them through his glasses. Please don't send us home, Violet said quietly, and all 3 teachers looked at her. I tried to get help, but she felt another sob coming up in her throat and tried to swallow it, only for it to come out anyways as a hiccup. Beside her, Ron hung his head. We'll go and get our stuff, he said, in a voice as hopeless as Violet felt. "What are you talking about, Weasley?" barked Professor McGonagall. "Well, you're expelling us, aren't you?" said Ron. Violet couldn't hold back the next sob. "Not today, mister." "Weasley," said Professor Dumbledore, and she could scarcely believe her ears. "But I must impress upon all of you the seriousness of what you have done. I will be writing to both your families tonight. I must also warn you that if you do anything like this again, I will have no choice but to expel you. I believe, however, that your heads of houses and I are all of the opinion that such action is unwarranted at this time." Violet finally raised her watery eyes to see Professor McGonagall nod crisply. Professor Snape was looking straight at her. His eyes flicked away as she met them. "I must go back to the feast, Minerva," Professor Dumbledore said lightly. "I've got to give a few notices. Come, Severus. There's a delicious-looking custard I want to sample." Snape shot a look of pure venom at Harry, and Ron as he allowed himself to be swept out of his own office, leaving them all alone with Professor McGonagall, who was still eyeing them like a wrathful eagle. "You better get along the hospital wing, Weasley, you're bleeding." "Not much," said Ron, hastily wiping the cut over his eye with his sleeve. "Professor, I wanted to watch my sister being sorted. The sorting ceremony is over," she said. "Your sister is in Gryffindor." "Oh, good," said Ron. "And speaking of Gryffindor," Professor McGonagall said sharply, but Harry cut in. "Professor, when we took the car, term hadn't started, so Gryffindor shouldn't really have any points taken from it, should it?" he finished, watching her anxiously. Professor McGonagall gave him a piercing look, but Violet was sure she had almost smiled. Her mouth looked less thin anyway. "I will not take any points from Gryffindor," she said, and Violet's mouth nearly fell open in shock. If she had tried that with Snape, "But the three of you will all be getting a detention." It was far better than Violet had expected. As for Dumbledore writing to the Dursleys, that was nothing. Violet knew perfectly well they'd just be disappointed that the Whomping Willow hadn't squashed her and Harry flat. Professor McGonagall raised her wand again and pointed it at Professor Snape's desk. A large plate of sandwiches, 3 silver goblets, and a jug of iced pumpkin juice appeared with a pop. "You will eat in here and then go straight to your dormitories," she said. "I must also return to the feast." When the door had closed behind her, Ron let out a long, low whistle. "I thought we'd had it," he said, grabbing a sandwich. "So did I," said Harry, taking one too. He handed it to Violet, who was busy scrubbing her face with the sleeve of her robes. "Can you believe our luck, though?" said Ron thickly through a mouthful of chicken and ham. "Fred and George must have flown that car 5 or 6 times, and no muggle ever saw them." He swallowed and took another huge bite. "Why couldn't we get through the barrier?" "It felt like something was stopping us," Violet said, nibbling at the corner of her own sandwich. Harry shrugged. "We'll have to watch our step from now on through," he said, taking a big swig of pumpkin juice. "Wish we could have gone up to the feast." "She didn't want us showing off," said Ron sagely. "Doesn't want people to think it's clever, arriving by flying car." When they'd eaten as many sandwiches as they could, the plate kept refilling itself. They rose and left the office, parting ways in the entrance hall to head off to their respective common rooms. Gryffindor Tower was somewhere up the grand marble staircase, Violet knew, but Slytherins lived and slept down in the dungeon deep below the surface of the Black Lake. The entrance onto the common room was a stretch of plain stone wall which Violet knew concealed a hidden door. She realized, suddenly, that she did not know the password. Biting her lip, Violet reached up and did something that she had not done since the school year before. She unfastened the long leather cord that hung around her neck and slipped free the gleaming silver ring that she kept hanging beside the polished bone pendant. With a deep breath, she pushed the ring onto her middle finger and walked straight through the solid wall. There was a loud gasp, and Violet immediately pulled the ring from her finger. Not a moment later, she was nearly bowled over by the force of Tracy Davis, slamming into her and wrapping her in a tight, enthusiastic hug. "Ik knew you'd make it," Tracy squealed, nearly lifting Violet off her feet in excitement. Malfoy said you'd be thrown out, but me and Cassius told him to shove it because Wecnuthi'd let you stay. They just had to. Oh, this is excellent. Missed you on the train, said the familiar voice of Cassius Warrington, and Violet opened her eyes to see him standing behind Tracy with his hands stuffed in his pockets, a crooked smirk on his long face. He reached out and pulled her into a one-armed hug. Sorry I'm late, Violet said shyly, extricating herself from the arms of her friends. I really missed you guys, too. You're not mad. Mad, Cassius laughed. You're joking, what for? If anything, I'm mad I wasn't there to watch Prissy Potter stealing a car. We didn't steal it, Violet said, her face going red. Well, it didn't steal it. I don't believe it, said Anu from further in the dormitory, and all three of them whirled around. Draco Malfoy was standing in the doorway that led to the boys' dormitory, an expression of pure shock on his pointed face. You're still her. Just flew in a bit ago, Violet said, sticking out her chin at what she hoped was a cocky angle. Were you waiting up for me, Malfoy? Malfoy's face went pink, but he looked furious. Are they letting you stay the night out of pity? He said nastily. Get one last look at the place before sending you back to the Muggles. She's not going anywhere, Cassius shot back, stepping in front of Violet to block her from Malfoy's view. And didn't I already tell you to shove off, you pox? Violet could just see the top of Malfoy's head over Cassius' shoulder, which had turned a vibrant shade of red under his white blonde hair. But a moment later he turned, and the sound of his footsteps disappeared back down the stairs to the boys' dormitories. Tracy burst out laughing. Even Violet, who had been feeling rotten for approximately 7 hours straight, couldn't stop the giggle from bubbling up through her lips. Cassius turned around and dropped his tough guy expression, replacing it with a cheesy smile. Right, now that he's gone, tell us everything.